Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order, the meeting of the Delta Stewardship Council, Thursday, March 26th. We will begin with a roll call beginning on my far left.
Tatayan here.
Eisenberg here.
Fiorini here. Johnston is here. Judge Damrell is here. Mayor Brown is here. We have a quorum, and at this time I would like to recess into a closed executive session. For those of you that are following on the webcast, we expect to be back in open session in about an hour and 20 minutes. So tune in about 10:30, we should be here. Good to go. Good morning, and I'd like to reconvene in open session and to report that there was no action taken in closed session. On to file item number 5, the adoption of the February 26, 2015 meeting. Council's pleasure. Eisenberg moves. Tatayan seconds. All approval beginning the vote to the right.
Yes.
Johnston, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Tatayan, aye.
Passes unanimously, and that reminds me that Council Member Tatayan was unanimously approved by the Senate and confirmed as a council member. So, Susan, welcome.
Thank
It's
you.
official.
Thank
Glad that went so well. File item number 6, the chair's report. I have 3 things that I wanted to provide to you. One, our workshop, the technical policy workshop that was conducted 2 weeks ago on levies and levy investment strategy, I thought was a very, very productive time. And for those of you that were there or were following along, it was clear that there was good engagement between our staff, council members, and the 5 expert panelists. And out of that has come a number of good thoughts to consider that are included in the staff report and the final item that will be, or the next to the final item that we'll be looking at today. An update for you on the lead scientist search. The interviews have been concluded, and we hope that within the next couple of weeks, the successor to Dr. Peter Goodwin will be announced. As we've mentioned before, and you're well aware, Peter has extended his tour of duty beyond the original commitment to provide time to find a successor. And so, Peter, we again express our appreciation for your filling the gap, and we'll find a time when we can more appropriately acknowledge that, but thank you. That concludes my report. Any questions or comments on file item 6? Hearing none, we'll move on to file item number 7, Executive Officer's Report. Jessica.
Thank you, and I'd like to add my congratulations to Susan. We're lucky to have you. I think how I'm going to structure this is I'm going to give my report and into which I will roll up the follow-up items, and then we'll move into the legal update and then conclude with the legislative update. So I want to get started by talking about some of the big ticket items that are swirling right now in the water world and Delta world. The first is drought response. Given the 4th consecutive drought year, you may have heard that the governor and leadership in the legislature last year announced $1 billion in drought emergency funds. in addition to the approximately $700 million that were approved last year. They indicated a desire to pass something before the spring legislative recess, which essentially would mean a vote happening today. I don't have the latest on that, and when Gavin joins us for the legislative report, he'll have details. PPIC released a report on drought this month entitled Policy Priorities for Managing Drought. This was born out of their Managing Drought event that they held in January in Sacramento, where they focused on Australia's millennial drought, lessons learned, and specifically what California should be doing. The upshot from their report was 4 recommendations to state leaders that needed reform. The first was improving water use information. They mentioned the need for increasing, expanding, and achieving uniformity for diversion, discharge information, and also the use of better models. Number 2 was setting clearer goals and priorities for public health. I know that in discussions in front of the state board, for example, there was a lot of question last year about precisely how much water was needed for life and safety and how you would go about quantifying that and planning for it. Number 3 is promoting water conservation and more resilient water supplies. Some of this is what the board recently took action on, a reduction in urban irrigation. They also recommended in the PPIC report the expansion of conservation-oriented pricing and the continued diversification of water supplies as follows in our Delta plan. And number 4 was strengthening environmental management. Specifically, they talked about better emergency planning in advance of droughts for protecting species, particularly those that are threatened and endangered. On a related note, the State Water Board, like I mentioned, in light of news that statewide water conservation had dropped off in January, and in recognition of the deterioration of water supply conditions, they convened this month to revisit their emergency drought regulations, which include requirements for the collection of expanded water use information. I wanted to let you know that we sent a staff comment letter to the board supporting the expansion of information collected under their regs. In particular, we encouraged the collection of water source data. They did make some adjustments at their meeting to their regs, although not specifically the ones we asked for, but we're in conversation with their staff. They have mentioned making future adjustments, and they're also set to make a determination in April about whether they will make their emergency regs permanent. In other news, the governor made 2 new appointments and 1 reappointment to the California Water Commission. They are also currently seeking a new executive officer, which is an important role given the $2.7 billion in storage funds from Prop 1 that the commission will oversee distribution of in the coming years. In council news, on March 19th, we had our Senate Budget Subcommittee hearing. My thanks to Pat Johnston, who did an outstanding job representing the council in the oversight portion of that hearing, and to Dan Ray, who represented the council during the budget portion. Our result was a bit of a mixed bag, but it's only one step in a journey that continues throughout the next few months. We did have support from a range of allies in our increased science funding request, ranging from the Nature Conservancy to the state and federal water contractors, and the Legislative Analyst's Office also highlighted the value of our science program during that hearing. The Prop 50 bond reappropriation and additional federal receivable authority we asked for was approved, but other items were held open for later discussion, perhaps until after the May revise. I won't go into any detail, but Randy mentioned that on March 11th we held a council meeting with an expert panel focused on our levee investment strategy. I think it was very well received and informative, and there's a summary of that meeting provided by staff that's in your board packet. And I want to express my appreciation to staff for having to pull together 2 council meetings this month, which is no easy feat. On March 16th, Peter will discuss this in more detail, but we held a Delta Challenges workshop, which is where there were cameos from our previous lead scientists, and it's yet another example of how our science program synthesizes best available information and science. And Peter will give you more details about what was learned during that workshop. We also held our second Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee Working Group meeting, which you may remember is focusing on the interim science action agenda and more specifically on narrowing actionable science priorities for 15-16 implementation. Reports are that it went very well, and this is all leading up to hopefully some important decisions being made at the May DPIC meeting. Routinely, council staff send comment letters providing guidance to other agencies related to the implementation of the Delta Plan, and there were a few this month. I mentioned the state board letter. We also sent a letter of support to the USDA Ag Research Service for continued funding of investigations and a Delta-wide project to control aquatic invasive weeds. We also used that letter to remind them of our plans to host a symposium on this issue this year. And this was a particular request of Councilmember Pifo. Staff also sent a comment letter to San Joaquin County suggesting changes to their general plan that would make it consistent with the Delta Plan. And this was followed by a meeting with county planning staff and one of the county supervisors, which Councilmember Pat Johnston also attended. As you have heard, DWR is contemplating the installation of emergency drought barriers in the Delta for the purpose of maintaining water supplies and quality given dire storage and flow conditions. We've met with DWR staff. We also sent comments, including raising some questions related to fish passage and temperature control. And I will expect that we will be hearing more about this issue as they determine when and whether to proceed. Looking ahead at April activities, on April 15th, we have our Assembly Budget Subcommittee hearing to argue our case in the other house. We also have 2 public meetings in the Delta related to the levee investment strategy work, one in Stockton on April 27th, and the other April 29th in Walnut Grove. And so in conclusion, as a matter of housekeeping, I wanted to follow up on a few requests of staff from the council. Councilmember Pifo had asked about our process for taking positions on bills. We do have an adopted bill position memo. It's available on our website. We circulated it to Councilmember Pifo. I can make a copy available for anyone who's interested. It essentially allows a process whereby our legislative director, which is a vacant position right now, would make a recommendation to the executive officer. I would then bring that recommendation to the council for a vote on any bill position. At last month's meeting, Ms. Pifo asked, well, we covered that one. Susan, you asked for a list of benefits that we've gotten from investment in Delta levies. That's in the works, and we'll have that for you by the April meeting. Phil, you also asked for a more complete listing of levee expenditures, specifically DWR's flood management spending on in-Delta levees and emergency response, and that we'll also have for you by the April meeting. And then Mary also asked for a schedule of upcoming restoration projects and expected expenditures, and that will be part of that package for the April meeting as well.
Great.
So unless there are any questions, we will move into our legal report.
We have one question.
Just a comment. I think it's really helpful for you to give us a list of the letters sent, the prominent meetings and stuff like that. It's one of the few ways to keep up between meetings. And so I'd encourage you to kind of follow that practice in the future.
Great.
Thank you. Oh, should I, Mr. Chairman, I do want to make, there's a statewide Public Policy Institute of California poll out this morning, and you may have seen it. And it's interesting that 92% of the California public have done either a lot or a little bit to save water, but 67% believe that their neighbors are wasting water.
A study in human behavior.
Or mathematics.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Jessica, before we move on to the legislative report, I wanted to acknowledge someone in the audience. I think for the first time, Michael George, the Delta Water Master, is here with us. Michael will be providing regular reports and updates on his activity for the council. But I believe, Michael, this is your first time here. It is. Well, where have I been? Okay. Welcome. good to have you with us. and,
First time sitting in the front row, maybe.
Maybe that's it. But you're doing great work. We're following your good work, and thank you for that.
Mr. Chairman, he also fielded all the hard questions at the budget hearing, so thank you.
Great. Okay, on to legislative report.
Chris,
So we're going to give you a brief legal update. I'm going to invite our legal intern, Cody, to come up, and he's going to provide a little more detail on one of the actions that the State Board recently did, which was a perfect segue for Master George. Maybe you can weigh in to provide some more context. And I think it's one of so many things that the State Board's doing now, trying to address this ever-changing situation. So Cody's going to talk about it without talking about the broader context of all the things the State Board's trying to address. It's kind of hard to get a real picture of what's going on. But and my understanding is that our staff is going to come back next month, or maybe in a following month, with a presentation on more of a comprehensive picture of State Board activities, because there's a lot of action going on real time, and so that's one thing Cody's going to talk about. The other is a case that we've been following that deals with pricing of water and how that may or may not affect the state's ability to implement meaningful conservation statewide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our legal intern, Cody Phillips.
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
So since our last legal update, as Chris mentioned, there have been several developments across the state that we felt warranted the council's attention. And I will start by just going into a little bit more detail regarding the State Water Board's actions in their investigative power. So last Tuesday, they approved what was a January 17 proposed rulemaking, which expanded the board's investigative power with regards to water rights. The regulations were submitted to the Office of Administrative Law on March 20th, and they will have 10 days now to either approve or deny. And because they are emergency regulations, if they're approved, they will be effective for 270 days, at which point they will be subject to readoption at the end of that term. The new regulations allow the board to issue an informational order to any water right holder to prove up their claim to their water, and they're able to do this as long as the board has received information pointing to the potential unreasonableness of the holder's method of diversion. Specifically, the regulations compel the water rights holder to prove their rights to the board in 4 situations. The first one is an alleged interference of a water right by any water right holder, diverter, or user, and importantly, this is a bit of a change, not only pre-1914 or riparian claimants. Second, claims of previously unasserted senior rights in response to an investigation or curtailment notice. Third, claims of unverified and previously unnoticed water transfers or contract purchases. And as opposed to previous regulations where information could be sought only when unlawful diversions were alleged, now the fourth scenario is threats of waste, unreasonable use, unreasonable method of diversion, and unlawful diversion of water. So it's threats. Now, if one of these 4 situations is applicable, the State Board can issue an informational order requiring the water right holder to submit additional information, which could include one of 6 things. And actually, that's not entirely fair because there's a sort of catch-all at the end, but 5 things plus a catch-all. The first is the claim of right. The property patent date is the second. Third, the date of the initial appropriation. Fourth, any diversions made or anticipated during the current drought year. And fifth, compliance with transfer law if the transfer diversion was not subject to approval of the board or the Department of Water Resources. And then the final situation is any other information relevant to authenticating the right or forecasting use and supplies in the current drought year. And so if the holder receiving the informational order fails to provide that information within 30 days, they may be liable to the board for $500 for each day of the continuing violation. And as mentioned above, these regulations are currently under review and will either be adopted or denied within the next week. So we'll know the status of this by next week. We will certainly be monitoring these regulations and their impacts going forward. It's important to keep in mind also that these regulations are a small piece of a much bigger puzzle that the Water Board is trying to accomplish. And this information is believed to help root out illegal diversions and as such hopefully increase the efficiency of water projects. The second issue we would like to bring to the Council's attention is a case from San Juan Capistrano, which focuses on the viability of tiered pricing of water as a conservation mechanism here in California. The case is the Capistrano Taxpayers Association versus the City of San Juan Capistrano, and it is currently awaiting decision on appeal in the 4th District California Court of Appeal in Orange County. The Capistrano Taxpayers Association, or CTA, filed a lawsuit against the city after they had expressed concern that the city's water rates and tiered billing structure violated Proposition 218, which establishes that ratepayers may only be charged the actual cost to deliver water and may not be charged for reclaimed water that they are not actually receiving. In August of 2013, the Orange County Superior Court agreed with the CTA and declared the city's water rates illegal under Proposition 218. The court also found that the city was in violation of a constitutional provision protecting against the waste of taxpayer funds. As a result, the city was ordered to abandon its water rate structure and to base all rates on cost of service. So, additionally, the court ordered the city to refrain from collecting fees from residents for recycled water that they do not actually use and which is not immediately available to them. Now, central to this case, and I'll just set this up really quickly for context, I'm sure you all are familiar with this, but central to this case and to the treatment of water as a commodity in general in our state is the difference between tiered pricing and cost of service. So the basic idea behind a tiered pricing scheme, very basic, is the more you use, the more you're charged. So in this case, for example, in the case of San Juan Capistrano, the lower tier, the lowest tier, was charged $2.40 for a unit of water, which was 748 gallons, whereas the highest tier was charged $9.05 for the same amount. The goal behind such pricing structure is to encourage conservation of water and reduction of use. This tiered pricing scheme is in contrast to a cost of service model, which, as the name implies, simply charges the users the amount it costs the city to provide them with their water, allowing for also a reasonable rate of return. In January 2014, the City of San Juan Capistrano City Council voted to appeal the trial court's decision. The city argued that the tiers were actually penalties and not fees, and as such, they are not subject to the restraints of Proposition 218. The city also argued that they were justified in requiring residential users to essentially subsidize recycled water users on the basis that everyone benefits from the use of recycled water because it increases supply. In the CTA's response, they responded to these arguments by saying that Proposition 218 expressly forbids charging for services not received by ratepayers. They further argued that even if the tiers were penalties and not fees, penalties in no way can be considered services and as a result may not be charged to ratepayers. So the case was heard by the appellate court in Orange County on January 21st of this year, and a ruling is expected by April 21st. We could hear any day, but the deadline is April 21st. That's 90 days from the original hearing of the case. If the appellate court rules in favor of the CTA, the city will be required to refund all of the money illegally paid, which would then be illegally paid by water ratepayers from August 2013 to the final date of the new legal water rate implementation, which was done in July of 2014, or until the date of the appeal decision, April 21st, whichever comes first. Cities and water agencies across California are nervously awaiting the decision of the appellate court. Should the lower court's decision be upheld, many water agencies could potentially be faced with changing the way they bill for water. On the other hand, customers may gain a new degree of clarity and transparency in regards to water agencies that perhaps arbitrarily charged for a necessary service. This case is especially relevant to the council as the Delta Plan supports the idea of tiered pricing and directly addresses Proposition 218 in Chapters 3 and 8 of the Delta Plan. Specifically, in Chapters 3 and 8, the Delta states the following language, quote, "Because of the complex nature of the policy issues and of certain funding and finance methods, a comprehensive and supportable Delta Plan finance plan will take time to develop. Thorough research is needed to identify entities that may be assessed user or stressor fees, determine appropriate levels for these fees, establish tiered fee structures, calculate the public benefits, and work through the legal implications of any financing strategy, including the practical effects of Propositions 218 and 26 on state and local financing mechanisms." Additionally, in Chapter 8, the plan states that, quote, "To the extent possible, user fees should be based on the amount of water used or, for stressors, the volume of contaminants discharged. Tiered fee structures also should be explored where applicable." Again, we will be keeping the pulse on this case over the next month, and we will likely have another update next month with the decision and the disposition from the court. Thank you.
Thank you, Cody. Any questions? Questions of Cody? No? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to call up our executive fellow, Gavin Landgraf, to present the legislative update.
Welcome, Gavin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, council members.
Good morning.
This legislative update has three different sections. I'm first going to go over the committee updates since my last report. Then I will go into some more details of the governor's drought relief appropriations bill that Jessica mentioned earlier. And then we will look at some of the notable bills from the legislative report and also some of the federal bills that we're tracking now. Very quickly on committee updates, as Jessica mentioned, we had our Senate Budget Subcommittee pre-hearing and our actual hearing this past month. And this coming month, we will be having our pre-hearing on April 3rd for the Assembly side and our actual hearing on April 15th. Additionally, tomorrow, the Senate Agriculture Subcommittee on Invasive Species will be holding an oversight hearing on aquatic weeds in the Delta. Senator Galgiani is organizing that hearing, and it will take place in Stockton. Second is the governor's drought relief appropriations bill. I handed out a two-sided piece of paper which has a summary from Natural Resources of the drought appropriations bill. On one side is a narrative summary of the important features of this appropriation bill, and on the other side is a financial breakdown of the different line items. So the governor and senior leadership in the legislature announced this $1.1 billion package on Thursday of last week, and it has been moving quickly through the legislature. The Assembly passed a pair of spot bills, Assembly Bill 91 and 92, on Monday, and then those were amended by the Senate on Tuesday to create the package. Yesterday, the Senate passed those bills and sent them back to the Assembly, and the Assembly is expected to vote today. I was checking my phone before I came up here, and it doesn't look like they have yet, but we're expecting a final vote, which would then be on the reconciled bill, since it's coming back to the Assembly, having passed the Assembly already on Monday. So in this handout that I put on your desks, it describes some of the details of this drought package. So the majority of the funds were already part of the governor's January budget proposal, and thus this is simply an acceleration of proposed spending. The single largest line item is $660 million of Prop 1E money for flood control in the Central Valley. And the other appropriations are for drinking water programs, water recycling infrastructure, food aid for communities directly affected by the drought, public outreach, and drought-related science. There are certain items that are new and are in addition to the governor's January budget proposal, and those are actually outlined on the narrative side of that Natural Resources Agency handout. In addition to AB 91, which makes the appropriations, AB 92, the second bill of the package, would give certain agencies more authority. So for example, AB 92 would give DFW more authority to regulate fish passages, unscreened diversions, and unauthorized diversions. And this is really where some of the controversy has been with this drought package. The appropriations portion of the package, AB 91, was passed almost unanimously by the Senate and will likely have a similar fate in the Assembly today. But the second half of it has been more controversial, with many Republican legislators expressing concern about the lack of a time horizon for these additional authorities that are given to state agencies, such as DFW. And those Republican legislators in committee hearings yesterday and on Tuesday expressed concerns that this emergency bill has implications that will last beyond when the drought has ended, at least on the authority side of the package. The third section of this report is on our regular bills, and in the binder is the list, which is quite long at this point, given that the drought is such an important issue, and water policy in general is such an important issue for the legislature this year. I just wanted to make a couple of notes on that. First, the bill markup period is well underway, and committees are hard at work amending these bills. So many of the ones that have a less specific nature right now are going to start to take on a more specific form, and we will be tracking those as provisions are added to them. I also wanted to highlight two to you. First is AB 501, which I mentioned at our last meeting, and that is the Delta Data Bill. No changes have been made since the last council meeting, but we will continue to monitor that bill as it develops. And second, Assemblymember Susan Eggman's Assembly Bill 747. And this is a bill that's directly related to the council's work. It's very similar to AB 2108 from the last session, which Assemblymember Eggman also introduced. And it would have the effect of loosening, if it takes the same form as last year's bill, it would have the effect of loosening restrictions on construction projects in Central Valley flood zones. Right now, it's still...
You said loosening the restrictions?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Right now, it is still a more nebulous spot bill, but if it follows the same path that it did last year, that's what we can expect from that bill. But we will continue to monitor that and report back to the council as that develops. And finally, I wanted to let you know that we are tracking federal legislation as well. I have no news to report on the federal drought relief bill negotiations, but there are some less high-profile bills that have been introduced, and the one that I wanted to highlight is HR 1060, which would accelerate the feasibility studies on Sites Reservoir and authorize the project should it be found feasible. And that was introduced by Congressman Garamendi. Thank you.
Gavin, thank you. Questions of Gavin? Great work.
Thank you.
Gavin's filling the gap with our Ledge Director Vacancy and doing
Quite
an
ably.
outstanding job. Yeah.
Thank you.
You
Thank you,
have
Mr.
found
Chair.
yourself a permanent position. Thank you.
I hope that offer is still available when I come back from Ireland.
That concludes my executive officer's report.
Okay. Any final questions on file item 7? Any public comment? Then we shall move on to file item number 8, the lead scientist report. Dr. Peter Goodwin.
Okay, thank you, Chair Fiorini, and good morning, everyone. And perhaps if Yumiko and Sam, if you would like to come down to the front, you may have something to add on the conferences. But first of all, I'd like to just wish everyone happy World Water Week. You're probably aware this is the World Water Week, and it's the 25th anniversary this time, so it's been going for a while. And Monday was World Water Day, and one of the activities that occurs on that day is the Stockholm Water Prize, which is regarded as the Nobel Prize in Water, was given out. And this year it was given to Rahindra Singh from India for a lifetime of grassroots work in local communities to alleviate the problems of drought. So basically he would cruise around and grassroots efforts to conserve water. Also, as part of that, on Monday, there's celebrations or activities go on all over the world. And a year ago, I was asked to attend the one in Michigan that focused on dams, both the dams in Michigan and the large-scale dams still being developed around the world. And that was very interesting just for two things. The reason I'm saying this, there were two interesting things that came out. The first was that on a panel discussion on Tuesday morning, one of the panelists was from Trout Unlimited, and that is one of the big issues in Michigan is what do you do with all of these low-head dams? And there's pros and cons. The cons, of course, if you have a trout stream, it really interferes with a free-running stream and the cool water. But they also serve as a migration barrier to invasive species. And so the person from Trout Unlimited said, well, my organization split on this, so I'm going to give the first half giving one side, take them out, and then the other half I'm going to say keep them in. So it was just a great illustration of just how difficult these water decisions are. And the second thing that I found very interesting, this was held right on the banks of the Great Lakes, and in a pretty small community. And there was a young couple there from California, and in one of the other panels, they made the comment that their water rates in Michigan in this small community was exactly double what they were paying for in Oceanside, California. And of course there's scaling there in a rural community, but it really brought home some of the emergency funding issues when you're in these small communities, just how difficult it is to produce the revenue to get a clean and reliable water source. So happy World Water Week, everyone. So this has been a very busy month for us in terms of support of outside activities. The first topic here is the Delta Challenges Workshop, and if you recall, this is a response to the letter we received last year from Secretary Laird and Deputy Secretary Mike Connor from the Department of the Interior. And the purpose of this workshop was to try and just put into one place, so it's a synthesis activity of the complexity of the Delta. And if you look out right now, great publications by PPIC, great publications from the National Research Council, many other great documents out there. But either those documents are so long, if you're not really into water, you're not going to read a 200-plus page report. So the purpose of this was not to look to the future, but to answer the question which is often posed by people outside California. That is, California water, it's really not that difficult. It's just that the stakes are so high, it's contentious. And you just need to get together and agree. And of course, anyone who knows anything about California water, just the science, the complexity of this rapidly changing system, the hub of the Bay Delta is just immensely complex. So the purpose of this panel we were asked to convene was to come up with just a very concise easily understandable description of the complexity of the system, primarily to you distribute to folks not intimately involved. As always, we have a planning committee that puts together the agenda, makes recommendations to the lead scientists for the panel members. And the planning committee had just a great idea. They said, if you're going to do this, why don't you invite all the former lead scientists to come back and be the panel? And that's what we did. And the lead scientists all gave, also they're experts in certain areas, but of course this synthesis effort really goes across a lot of areas. So they made suggestions of folks they would like to hear from, and in addition to that, that was supplemented by the planning committee. So on March the 16th, the meeting was held, of course, public meeting. It was structured around the co-equal goals and Delta as place. So those were the three themes: water supply reliability, ecosystem recovery, and then the whole series of Delta as place issues. So we will be expecting that report, and we'll be able to report back to you, we hope, by the next council meeting. And for those of you who haven't attended one of these panel meetings before, at the end, we do two things. Of course, there's the opportunity for public comment, but also the panel give an indication of what their thinking is. And one of the interesting comments was that, gosh, we thought this was such a great idea, which is why we all came. And we've sat through this, and now we realize just how difficult this is. So, you, of course, to encapsulate the complexity of the system, and we're asking for a report of 15, no more than 20 pages. So that's the Delta Challenges workshop. Are there any questions about that? There were also two large conferences in addition to the biennial conference and the State of the Estuary conference. There are two annual meetings that occur regularly on Delta issues. The first, which was held on March the 9th to the 11th in Folsom, is the California Water and Environmental Modeling Forum. And this is a meeting where engineers, scientists, computer programmers get together to really discuss the models, particularly the hydrodynamic models, the hydrology models. You have to give presentations, to have sessions where people can engage with one another. And just a few of the topics which were discussed at this year's meeting. There was also some presentations of economic models which are being developed and being used to do a post-analysis of the drought impact of 2014. Discussions on the drought. There was a whole session on the California Water Plan, which was updated this year. That was very well received, a lot of discussion around that. And of course, with the new groundwater legislation, there was a lot of discussion about modeling for sustainable groundwater management. And related to that, there was a session on the pest model. And for Chair Fiorini, you recall when we were up in Idaho, that pest model was actually used to calibrate a model in a very transparent and defensible way. So it was very interesting. There was an entire session devoted to those techniques. Perhaps I'll just go on to the second meeting and then ask either Yumiko or Sam if they have anything to add. The second meeting is the Interagency Ecological Program Annual Workshop, and for the last few years these two conferences are held back to back, with the middle day of the week, the Wednesday, being an overlap. So the idea is the ecologists and the modelers, if you like, the two sides of the co-equal goals have a joint day. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible this year because the QEMF, our usual date, conflicted with the North American Fisheries Society conference. So the IEP conference was held March 18th to the 20th and covered several topics, of course, the life cycle models, particularly for Delta smelt, And for salmon, that's been ongoing, but there's now life cycle models being developed for several of the other species. There were also several presentations on emerging technologies, you particularly, as the council's heard about and have suggested as a priority, how do we know where the fish are and how they're behaving? Also, descriptions and analyses of fish entrainment evaluation methods, particularly for the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project. And the last thing which was came out fairly strongly was food web dynamics, particularly contaminants effects on food webs. Before I see if Sam and Yumiko have anything to add to that, I would just extend an open invitation to all of the council members. I think in the past we've had one or two council members have dropped by, and I think possibly this year we didn't do a good enough job in explaining what could be of interest to the various council members. But please just consider with our conferences and IEP and the Delta Challenges, there is an open invitation from the science community to attend and participate in any of the sections that are of particular importance to you or your constituents. But Sam or Yumiko, did you have anything to add on some of the details?
Yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the predation work that was highlighted at the conference. I know that council has been interested in that, and it is one of the recommendations in the Delta Plan. So there were at least 7 presentations, oral presentations on predation at the workshop. So really a fairly strong representation in that area. There's usually not that much in predation in this workshop. There was some really interesting work going on. There's some new technologies that are being looked at. There was a project by Sean Hayes with NOAA Fisheries that uses these drifters, which are floating like a bobber with a string on the bottom, and they tie a poor little salmon smolt to the bottom of it. It actually has a GoPro camera attached to it. So as these things go down the river, when this little fish gets eaten, it records the time and the place, and also takes a picture of what species it was, so they can actually identify get a measure of how many predators are present and which species are doing it. So that was interesting. Another emerging technology that was presented was another NOAA fisheries scientist, and Dave Demmer, and he showed some work that he's done with probably the world's best fish finder. It uses sonar, like using a regular fish finder for boat, but really very sophisticated, and is running down the same stretch of the San Joaquin River that they did the other studies, and they can actually count how many predators are there. And not only that, but the technology has advanced to the point where they can actually identify from this little signal that comes back which species they think. They can distinguish 4 or 5 species. And at the same time, they get this extremely detailed 3-dimensional representation of the bottom contour, which is something that's not always available. So really interesting work. And
You attracted the attention of the fishermen in the audience with that new technology.
Skeptical, but I will buy it.
It's pretty impressive technology. This is not like your regular fish finder. These things have big transducers that are about that big and shine out all directions from the boat. So it's pretty impressive technology, and it's used in other areas too. So I think I'll stop
Sam,
there.
thanks for the update on the predation. I had asked staff to provide us an update on the multiple activities that had been launched over the last 2 or 3 years, just to get an update on where we are as a science program and as a council. So it's encouraging, and I look forward to getting and providing the council with an update on that activities and that related to that issue.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so no other questions. Maybe we'll go to by the numbers, and Yumiko, a lot been going on this month.
Yes. Good morning. So there has been an update to the by the numbers document, and I've placed those in front of you. The color scheme hasn't changed much. Things are still quite red. In terms of rain, we did have about an inch from last month in the Northern Sierra and about a third of an inch in the Southern Sierra, bringing us to not to average levels yet. So we are experiencing very low rain events. What I do want to focus your attention on is the snowpack this month. It is currently at record lows. This month, the manual survey came up to 2 inches in the Northern Sierra, which is 8% of the seasonal average. The Central Sierra at 3 inches, which is 10% of the seasonal average. And the statewide average coming in at 3 inches, which is 9% of the state average. Peter focused me on this really good graph that the DWR has regarding snowpack, snow water content over the years, and I did put this in front of you as well. Just to explain what it is snow water content in comparison to the April 1st average, which is considered the peak amount of snow, and it's a monthly average over the year. And the light blue shaded region is the historical average, and the light sort of blue line at the top is the maximum year, the wettest year, which was 1982 to 1983. And the red line is the driest year, which was 1976 to 1977. And if you can see, we are currently at the dark blue line, which is below the driest year. So this does have serious implications in terms of irrigation, as most of the reservoirs that do provide irrigation are primarily fed by snowmelt. So this may result in some issues in the summer. So now on to water supply. The rain didn't quite help the reservoirs much. And the values on these sheets that I have been presenting is the current volumes in the reservoirs compared to the 30-year historic average. I was forewarned, however, by Peter that some of you may be curious about what the percent capacity is, so I will also discuss those as well. Shasta is currently at 59% capacity, which is 74% of the historical average. And this is down from 79% of last month. Oroville is at 50% capacity, which is 68% of the historic average, down from 70% last month. And San Luis is at 67% capacity, which is actually also is 75% of the historic average, which is actually up from 74 last month. Water flow has also been falling quite a bit due to the lack of rain, with flows going down about half from last month. For example, the Sacramento River last month was 12,365, and this month is 6,837. Salinity, on the other hand, has not changed that much. Also, the combined Central Valley Project and State Water Project diversions are currently at 1,550, which is the minimum allowed for public health and safety. So that is a value to note. Now on to the fish. We've added a little variety with the fall run Chinook salmon values, but I will begin with a little bit of negative news with the Delta smelt. Although no Delta smelt were salvaged at the salvage stations, the March spring Kodiak trawl catch was 6, which is actually a historic low for this month. Just for comparison, last year's March spring Kodiak trawl catch was 88. So there's been various speculation on why this may be, but this is of concern. Now for the more positive news, the preseason forecast for those avid anglers for salmon abundance this year for the Sacramento River is 651,985, which is actually a bit higher than last year's forecast, which was 634,650. This is good news, but then I'm going to go on and end on a sour note, saying that this high value may seem a little strange to people who may be wondering why we're getting such high salmon values given the drought. And the reason most likely is that these returning salmon are 2 to 3 years old, which means as juveniles, they were not as affected by the current drought. And so you'd probably be expecting lower salmon forecasts in the upcoming years. So that concludes the report. Are there any questions?
Yumiko, thanks for including the snowpack information, supplementing by the numbers. I think the 74 and the 68% reservoir storage numbers are misleading. Typically, snow-fed reservoirs won't peak until June or July because of the runoff. But given the condition of the snowpack, it's likely there will be no runoff. Most of the melt will be absorbed into the soil before it ever hits the reservoir. So we may be looking at the highest numbers for the year, which doesn't bode well for the remainder of the year and the year ending. I also hate to offer a sour note, but that's the reality that we're dealing with today. Any questions or comments for either Sam or Yumiko? Okay, great. Thank you both very much. Peter?
Yeah, thank you. And just thanks to Yumiko for putting all of that together.
Okay, I think that concludes file item 8. Any public comment? None. On to file item number 9, priorities for 2015. Jessica?
Thank you, and I'd like to invite up our Chief Deputy Dan Ray, our Planning and Performance Deputy Cindy Messer, and then I believe that Reiner is going to join us as well, our Science Deputy. They'll be available for questions after I make a brief presentation. I noticed that we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I will make my presentation quick, and then we can get to any questions that you may have. So about 1.5 years ago, this board adopted a very ambitious Delta Plan. It's an enforceable long-term management plan, our guiding document, and it includes 14 regulations and over 70 recommendations, which are to be implemented by a range of government agencies, not just the council. So today, it's my pleasure to present to you our effort to set annual priorities, as we did last year, for the council based on the Delta Plan. They are also drawn from requirements of the Delta Reform Act, direction received from council members, staff's judgment based on policy opportunities that we are aware of, as well as current events like the drought, and cross-cutting discussions of priorities that have occurred at the Interagency Implementation Committee. Precedence is given where the council has a clear lead role in a matter, such as the levee investment strategy work and specific implementation items from the Delta Science Plan, for example. The work plan also reflects priorities from the Governor's California Water Action Plan that was issued last year, which highlighted several Delta Plan items. And you will notice carryover categories from last year, such as our levee investment strategy and land use and local planning, but there are also new areas of focus, such as following up on many of the water supply reliability recommendations that you adopted in the Delta Plan, including our promise to evaluate and revisit the way we approach single-year water transfers, for example. Our work plan builds on activities and deliverables from last year. For example, last year staff developed a habitat restoration issue paper for your consideration, and this year staff will focus on implementing the recommendations that came out of that issue paper. So today, really, I'm looking for general concurrence from the board that you agree these are the right areas of focus for 2015 for the council. I must point out that given the severity of the drought, unanticipated events or opportunities may cause us to further shift or revisit some of these priorities. We can address those as they arise. And if a change of course significantly impacts our work plan, we will bring those issues to the chair or where appropriate to the full council to discuss them. And indeed, many of the tasks on the sheet before you tie directly or indirectly to drought response or build towards future drought resilience. But in the meantime, it's important, I believe, to have a clear and focused work plan for the year, for my purposes in managing the agency, and for you to be engaged, informed, and to understand what I'm to be held accountable for at the end of the year. So turning our attention to the details, attachment 1 on item 9, this is a 2-part document. You'll see it organized as 6 priority program areas and 7 core functions. These core functions, this is a similar structure that we used last year, they represent a great deal of activity and effort and the need for sustained staff attention. While they may be routine, it does not mean they are unimportant. They range from preparation, intensive public meeting support, which the council is known for, our public meetings, which occur sometimes as often as 4 times a month. And they also reach to the furtherance of critical policy matters like the refinement of our performance measures or the maintenance and administration of our covered action regulatory program, including our very active early consultation feature of that program. So I'm going to quickly highlight the priority areas as well as a few illustrative examples of tasks. Then I'm going to turn to Peter for his comments on the science priorities. And then we have our senior staff assembled here at the table to answer any questions or to assist me and Peter in answering questions. So the first is our continued work on the Delta Levee investment strategy. Again, an example where the council is the lead. Last year, we laid the foundation for a successful project. We built the team, we launched an outreach program, we conducted information collection and synthesis, and this year, as you already know, based on the January and February meetings, we're really getting into the meatier policy issues. In 2015, we'll develop a methodology for evaluating state investment choices. We'll conduct a peer review of that methodology. We'll initiate an environmental assessment of the program consistent with CEQA, and we'll continue our outreach efforts to elicit continued public input. By the end of the year, our intention is to have drafts of all of our final products, a preferred alternative / proposed amendment to the Delta Plan, a draft EIR, draft changes to our regulation, and a draft report to the legislature. Next is science plan implementation, or actionable science, as we've been referring to it. Building on 2014 Science Action Agenda, we're already working with the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, or DPIC agencies, to identify high-priority science actions. This is led ably by Tarn Ravazzini. We intend to fund them through a mix of joint proposal solicitation packages, directed investigations, and science fellowships, potentially using funds from our 2015-16 budget, or at the very least in cooperation with other agencies. In addition, the State of Bay Delta Science Report will be drafted and ready for publication. On ecosystem restoration, which is the third priority area, the council staff will help to accelerate progress towards the Delta Plan's objectives for tidal marsh and floodplain restoration by encouraging 9 high-priority restoration projects and implementing recommendations of the habitat issue paper I mentioned earlier. We also stand ready to review the BDCP's recirculated restoration components. We will host a symposium to assess the best available science to support management of invasive aquatic weeds. And we lend our staff expertise to support development of landscape-scale habitat restoration framework, which we promote in the Delta Plan, with the goal of improved outcomes in restoration projects and getting projects on the ground. The next category is flows and associated stressors. Updating the flow objectives of the State Water Board's regulatory Bay Delta Plan is extremely important to providing more certainty about the amount of water that will be available for all uses, for beneficial use and for the Delta ecosystem. Our science program will continue to provide science support as requested, and staff continue to participate in the CAMPT, or the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, which informs and improves flow management by the state and federal water projects. On the land use front, we have learned since the Delta Plan has been in place that land use decisions affecting the Delta really required our continued attention. We do this in order to ensure consistency with our adopted policies so that there aren't conflicting plans that are managing aspects of the Delta. Perhaps an understated aspect of what we do, really, staff track and comment on all Delta local agency land use plans and actions, as well as regional transportation plans, and what are known as sustainable community strategies. Currently, one of the issues we're focused on in this area is the update of San Joaquin County's general plan. As I mentioned in my executive officer's report, we engage directly with county planning staff as well as elected officials to convey our concerns and suggestions. Also, as the Delta Protection Commission launches an update of its guiding document, the Land Use and Natural Resource Plan, we will coordinate to encourage compatibility with the Delta Plan and offer comments and suggestions as well. Additionally, new this year, we're gathering information about Delta energy facilities and plans in consultation with the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission, and to better understand how they may affect the implementation of the Delta Plan and to get a better understanding of what the assets and the risks really are. Staff also contributes, as asked, to activities of the Delta Protection Commission and Conservancy to protect Delta's place, and this takes a variety of forms. On water supply reliability, kind of a new and focused emphasis this year, we will focus on progress in implementing the Delta Plan's recommendations about water transfers, improving local agencies' water use reporting and planning to help reduce reliance on Delta water supplies, which is the diversification of supply issue, groundwater management and integrated regional water management activities that were authorized in 2014 or will be funded through Prop 1. There are a number of grant guideline proposals that are circulating or will be circulating this year, including on IRWM, that we'll be paying close attention to. So, like I said, I've assembled senior staff here to answer questions, but first I want to pass the mic to Peter to say a few words about this year's proposed science activities.
Okay, well, thank you, Jessica, and I think you captured it very well, but I'll just maybe highlight a few things in the package for you. And perhaps be very obvious, of course, the Delta Plan is structured on best available science. It's one of the most fundamental tenets in the plan itself. GR1 called for the Delta Science Plan, and the reason for that was that there's a wide recognition that there needs to be a new way of doing the business of science, moving towards collaboration and away from, as Dr. Mount, I think, referred to it, the combat science. So 2015 really emphasizes making the elements of the science plan a reality and seeing how some of these new approaches work. As Jessica mentioned, the actionable science, the converting the interim science action agenda to a series of high priority and fundable actions later that year. We refer to it as the gaps and glue. That's already well underway. And I'd like to also just acknowledge Taran for being the glue in making that whole effort happen. And related to that, it really is important that funds are got out to do science. There's very big questions that need to be addressed, obviously. But also, as we're in this great drought of funding science, a lot of the major programs that traditionally have provided support to agencies, and even with agencies themselves, you are right at the end of that last cycle of funding. So either these groups are going to be looking elsewhere to keep their groups going, or in some instances, as we heard last week at the QEMF meeting, that some may even close. So the importance of getting funding out onto the street in a way that these groups can compete for those resources is very important. We're also going to use the DPIC experience and Taran's efforts to guide how we may put together the full science action agenda in the future. So the whole process has been and will continue to be a valuable learning experience. State of Bay Delta Science, just to fill in a few gaps on that, if you recall, we're on this cycle in the science plan, decide what you're going to do, that's a science action agenda, do it, and then come back and do an assessment to see how effective it is. Do those high priority themes, Do we know enough in that issue now? Do we need to realign? What are the new topics? So the state of the Bay Delta science is the process that assesses what's going on and to capture our current understanding of the system. Without going into the details now, we've got a very innovative way of doing that. It's very different. Both our Science Advisory Committee and the Independent Science Board, you weighed in and you're asking, how's this going to be used? How's it going to be most effective? And so you're going to see a very different format coming out later this year. I'd also just like to build on what Jessica said, just with the drought and the many, many tough questions that agencies are having to face. We're expecting a lot of science panels coming up this year. And as Jessica mentioned, the need to have flexibility. So if we get asked to weigh in on some of these very tough decisions, clearly we want to be in a position to make on-the-fly modifications so we can accommodate those when it fits with the Council's priorities. I don't think Jessica mentioned science conferences, one-day seminars, and brown bags. That's obviously a very important part of bringing scientists together, but also communicating the results of science. And as the year goes on, we certainly welcome ideas from council members, particularly with brown bags. So if you see issues coming up, you're being asked a lot of difficult questions, and it would be helpful to have your brown bag. And of course, these are online, Asia. So if things come up that would be of help for you, please let us know. And I think one other big item coming up that you'll see in here in May is the integrated modeling workshop. This was part of the science plan, and this is going to be quite an activity. We're conducting it in collaboration and with support of the National Science Foundation, so that more information will be coming out on this in the next 2 weeks or so. The dates of that will be May the 21st and 22nd. So I think that's just highlighting a few things here. But Jessica, I'll turn it back to you, and then our staff may have things to weigh in as well.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. So I just ask whether what we have in front of you today reflects what you believe or agree are the most important issues for the Council to address this year, hopefully because of conversations we've had either at Council meetings or maybe one-on-one. These are not a surprise to you. I've had many discussions with the chair and some with the vice chair as well. But I welcome any comments, questions, suggestions at this time.
Council members, comments, questions? Susan, and then Phil.
Just a quick question. Our role in the Collaborative Adaptive Management team, are we providing science advice?
Either Peter or Reiner, I don't know who it's appropriate to weigh in first.
Okay. Our primary role is to make sure that we manage the deliberation and review process according to the procedures that we've developed for peer review and advice that's listed in the Delta Science Plan. So we're essentially tracking and helping break through some of the difficult bumps in the road that sometimes occur. But at this point, our primary role is essentially to assemble peer review panels to assess the credibility of the proposals that are coming out and the project work teams that are going to be working on narrowing some of those information gaps and overcoming some of the disagreements among the different parties. And then at the end, to have those panels reconvene and review the end product that comes out of the process.
Reiner, for the benefit of those that are following along on the web, can you identify your role of the Delta Science Program?
I'm sorry. I am Reiner Honicke. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for Science.
Thanks. Phil?
Actually, could I just add one point to that, just to remind the council members that when we heard from Dr. Connor and Leo Winternetz when this camp process was being developed, they were very clear that they wanted to use the camp process to road test many of the procedures in the science plan. And so we're actually using that to see, is it working? So we're very appreciative of that. So it's a very close relation.
Okay, Phil?
Jess, I gravitated to the chart you prepared for the document once I got past the memo, and I frankly think this is potentially one of the more important management tools and ways for us to understand what's going on. And I would urge your consideration of more than a yearly update on this kind of stuff. I mean, it's just very useful. Just a couple summer issues and questions, but I like generally the ranking, and I like the 6 subject areas, but the charts didn't quite follow the subject area categories, and I couldn't figure out, and I must confess, I took this all out of the binder to read it, and I dropped it on the floor. And since it was put in the binder and it punched through the whole page description on the thing, it took me a couple of minutes to figure it out. But it just is a mechanical clarification. The other thing is, I thought policy objective guiding language was one of the more interesting ways to start this, where you could just go back to original documents. I just noted on the Levee investment strategy, you don't have comparable to what you have in some of the other areas on guiding language. Now, I think that's probably just, starting to use this kind of stuff, but I would just think that would be a really interesting thing to maintain. On the science plan implementation, actionable science, I would have put budget stuff in here as well, because one of the things you wind up doing is talking about activities that require funding. But illustration for refinements in the future, take a look at habitat restoration, which I thought was really interesting. The statutes were missing in the first box, but that's just a technical problem. It would be helpful in areas like number 2, provide regulatory coordination, where you say advance key projects. I'd like to know what advance means. And the list here was interesting to me, but it raised the question, what happened to the southern San Joaquin flood control with some kind of ecosystem benefit to this list? I don't know.
Do we have a response?
We can speak to that.
Yeah. San Joaquin River floodplain.
Okay. Actually, there are some activities, obviously, underway around that element, and I think that for the most part, I'm thinking of some of the work the Delta Conservancy is doing right now as part of their Delta Dialogue and some of their other outreach efforts that we've been participating in. Still very much in a discussion planning stage, but hopeful that it will move forward to a project that around the Paradise Cut area that will bring groups together in terms of consensus on what might be doable for restoration down there and where there might be agreement. Mm-hmm. So could be added. I think it's a little bit earlier in its stage and activities compared to some of these others, which was one reason we didn't put it in here.
I mean, in some way, it's a little unfair to start with a levy investment strategy, because that is a more
fleshed out project management.
Yeah, you have a big project management team, you have consultants involved, you've got DWR funding of a major sort, and a long history of us noodling around with the issue. But in fairness, that's the direction you want to head for all these others too. So the land use stuff, just to jump ahead to the other section, the narrative in the staff memo mentioned the San Joaquin General Plan, which is probably one of the more important issues, but the chart itself did not. I mean, these are all minor things. The point is, I think it's a terrific tool, and hopefully it's useful to you as an administrative tool as well as to me, because I learned things.
Good.
a lot
Yeah,
of
it's
effort.
certainly easier for us to be very specific on milestones and deliverables when we have the budget and the consulting team and
Right.
the authority in law.
Other comments or questions? Jessica, I think you've done a great job. I know I've observed staff work very hard over quite a period of time to hone this, and it's a great document. And as you pointed out,
It'll be a working document.
it's a working document. Things can change, and a lot of the activities are dependent upon the activities of other agencies. But it's an ambitious plan, and look forward to watching it unfold before us over this next year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes file item number 9. Any public comment on this matter? Hearing none, we will now break for lunch and reconvene at 1 o'clock. Reconvene after the lunch hour and proceed with file item number 10, Delta Levee Investment Strategy, Determination of State Interests. This is an action item.
This on? Oh, it is now. Okay.
Yes, good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to kick this off. I will run us through staff report and some of the key elements that we included in that, and then from there, I imagine we will have quite a discussion. The primary purpose of this agenda item today is to request the council's approval of a list of state interests that should be further considered as we move along in developing and updating our Delta Levee investment strategy, as well as updating various other Delta Plan provisions related to risk reduction and levee investments. And specifically, we're seeking the council's guidance today to help us do several things. One is to inform our technical team, our project team, as to the interests that they need to focus on as they're moving forward, developing the methodology, developing the risk assessment, as we're getting ready for the peer review process that will kick off next month. And also what we're seeking through this guidance is a sense of the interests that remain on the list, and therefore we as staff will continue to have various meetings and discussions with the right responsible entities and organizations for these different interests and assets, because as you can imagine, we need to stay very focused, it's very time intensive, and we want to make sure we're talking to the right people at the right time as we're developing the methodology and the levee investment strategy. So I wanted to just explain a little bit about the timing. The discussion today that we will have and the council's decision will actually bring us full circle and bring us some closure in terms of a 3-month process that we've been undertaking, having this discussion with the council regarding state interests. And during this 3 months, we as staff have provided various presentations to the council, various pieces of information for your consideration, as well as hearing from different panel members, both agency representatives as well as our technical experts that we heard from just a few weeks ago. And of course, during the last 3 months, we've engaged in various discussion with the council as well as hearing from stakeholders during public testimony. So in today's staff report, or attached to today's report, we have 2 pieces of information that we've provided. The first is a slightly revised version of 4 alternative approaches to, if you will, packaging state interests in different ways, that would allow or offer guidance in terms of developing the Delta Levee investment strategy and what interests would be part of that strategy versus those that may not be. Again, I will say as I think I've mentioned in previous presentations about this element, this was one means to bring the state interest before the council for discussion, and these alternatives ranged from very broad to a more narrow approach. Probably more importantly is the second attachment to today's staff report, which is a list of recommended state interests, staff recommended state interests, that should be further considered and evaluated as we're developing the levee investment strategy. And this is the list that we would point your attention to for the discussion today. Obviously, this is a list we feel that is not set in stone, but our recommendations. This will allow us as staff to move forward, to focus our efforts, and in terms of evaluating different interests. And as we move through time, we foresee bringing back different elements before the council to update you on in terms of what we've figured out, what the results are of different risk analysis around these various interests, what the consequences might look like. Just it will, as time goes on and we, as the technical side of the team, look at these various interests, run them through our proposed methodology, we'll be able to bring some additional information, detailed information back before the council. In the list that's part of or is attachment to your staff report, staff are recommending a more robust suite of state interests for the council to consider. And we are suggesting this broader approach for several reasons. The first is that we feel that this suite of interests are reflective of what's in statute. They're reflective of what's in the Delta Plan, as well as other relevant planning documents for the Delta, whether it be the flood plan, Sassoon Marsh Protection Plan, Economic Sustainability Plan, and others. And this broader list that's included as attachment 2 is also reflective of what we've heard during our public meetings from the stakeholders and their testimony, as well as some of the more one-on-one or individual meetings staff have had with stakeholders. The list itself captures broad categories of interests, which at least I feel there's agreement on those, including protection of people, property, water supply, ecosystem, the co-equal goals, if you will, and Delta as place values. But what we have also included in the list is more detailed level of interest under those broad categories that might warrant further consideration as part of the updated levee investment strategy. We believe that, at least from the technical project team side of things, that further evaluation of the suite of interests will provide us with information on the risks associated with these interests, the benefits that are received from protecting these values and interests, and who the beneficiaries are that receive this protection, and how they might factor into a modified cost allocation, cost share scenario, which, as you know, is also part of our charge under developing the levee investment strategy. We also believe it will give us an opportunity to look at how certain levee investments provide protection or reduce risk to some interests and where that may overlap with others and give us a little more bang for the buck, but also allow us to see the picture of achieving multiple objectives or multiple goals with specific types of levee investments. As I mentioned, our intention is, as time goes on, as we move through this process, we evaluate this list of interests using the methodology that we're developing. And of course, once that methodology's been finalized through the peer review process, that we'd be able to come back to the council and give you a fuller picture of what we know, where the limitations might be in terms of evaluating these interests and how they fit into the bigger picture of the strategy. I would also suggest that this broader suite of interests, this lengthier list, is reflective of a few things that we heard at the March 11th Council Expert Workshop, including it's reflective of this big picture approach. And also, as I think Dr. Mount suggested, that it uses the Delta Plan as a guide. So it's very reflective of the broad suite of elements and interests we have in the Delta Plan. Lastly, I should probably touch a little bit upon the shorter list of interests that staff are recommending not, perhaps if you will, stay on the table for further evaluation under the proposed methodology for our levy investment strategy. And these, of course, as you have read, include some cultural, historical values, namely those that occur outside of legacy communities. So maybe it would be a historical structure alone on some island outside of the legacy community. Some aesthetic values, we suggested that meandering channels might be one of these, and recreational interest or values. And I'd like to just point out that in putting these particular interests on the shorter list of those we suggest we might not be considered for further evaluation, our thinking is that these are interests that would not be the primary focus of a major levee improvement project, but instead we would, I guess, advocate that where there are opportunities to incorporate recreation, for example, in particular levee improvement projects, we would look for those. But where we suggest heading with this list of interests are, these are the interests that would be the primary focus of different levee improvement projects. And the last thing that I want to touch upon is a meeting that Dustin Jones and I had with Mr. Eric Ringelberg a few weeks back. If you will recall, in February, Mr. Ringelberg gave some public testimony and suggested that he, and actually it turns out Melinda Terry sorry, let me take a step back here. They had some suggestions, some ideas for different ways we might approach the state interests and some adjustments we might want to think about making to our 4 alternative approaches. So we had a very good meeting with Eric. He and Melinda jointly developed a list of adjustments. They actually had some points of clarification that Dustin and I found very useful. One, for example, I'll offer is the idea of fat levies. I know we had some discussion about that at our last council meeting. And one point of clarification and discussion that we had with Eric is that the options to use the fat levy configuration really applied mostly to the central and southern parts of the Delta, perhaps not so much in the northern part of the Delta. So it was a good discussion in terms of if we choose to keep this as the type of format for information, maybe we would make some points of clarification within it. And then lastly, we talked about some different alternatives that they had in mind and had developed. And I think as staff, we would want to continue a discussion with them and perhaps look at some of these other alternatives as we move through our CEQA process, as we move through more intense deliberations and discussions about levy investments and the suites of interest that those would be focused on. So I just wanted to acknowledge their work, and indeed we did meet with them since the last council meeting. And I think with that, that's at least the highlights from the staff report. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Dan?
Yeah, again, you know, the starting point for this is the statute says we're supposed to identify priorities for state investment in Delta levees that protect lives, property, and that further state interests. So we want to make sure we understand what state interests you think are important. It's not like these other issues like recreation or aesthetics won't get some consideration in terms of understanding what the impacts of those priorities might be when we get to the environmental impact report stage. Well, obviously, we're going to be looking at, well, how will this affect recreation, or how does this affect the aesthetics of the value? Those are statutory requirements that we'll have to evaluate at that stage. But we're really trying to understand is what are potential priorities that would warrant the expenditure of state levy money that you think are important. And we're trying to make sure we're considering those things that you really think warrant potential consideration, because we don't want to go down the path and have left something out and find out in October, oh, geez, I really would love to have spent levy money on bike paths or, protecting archaeological sites. But so we want to make sure we haven't narrowed it too much, but we don't want to leave us till the last minute to have to start focusing ourselves. Our hope is that we can, over the coming months, become better and better understand what you all think are the priorities that really warrant state investment of levy funds.
And I think and I'll add to that, in the next agenda item, when Larry Roth comes up to give his presentation on, it's a continuation of the risk analysis, you'll see some of the efforts we've undertaken so far to develop metrics around measuring risk and measuring the consequences for a broader suite of state interests. And hopefully that'll tie back to the type of work the consulting team is doing and why it's so critical we get this guidance at this point in time, because it is pretty intensive work and we want to be able to move forward with that beyond just the broader categories.
So specifically, you're asking the council to react to attachment number 2?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Comments, questions?
You only want to talk about number 2 now? I'm just asking.
It's completely up to you. I would just advocate
Okay, let me,
that would be the focus.
When a item, highways or petroleum pipelines, appears on this list, do you give it a ranking as to, are highways more important or less important or equally important to pipelines?
We're not suggesting at this
Yeah.
stage that one would be,
Okay.
take precedence over other. We're just trying to make sure we've identified
Yeah,
things that are important.
Right.
Okay, that's what I thought it is, but the problem is a list of things always tends to get expanded because people say, well, this is clearly important. Elsewhere in the discussion, you attempt to narrow down the scope of things, and you actually have some items you think should not be part of a levy investment strategy. Maybe desirable things, but not a levy investment strategy. And I know you're going to be doing a refinement of this, and I like the approach, but I think you have to put cautions in here. Either you believe that, and I think this is where you're headed, protecting human life and the co-equal goals are the two most important. That's where I think you're headed. I don't know that. You have to say that with clarity in order to put in perspective the listing of miscellaneous related issues, albeit important, as secondary important, if you're going to make that determination. Because if you don't, then your matrix will treat highways equal to human life, or water quality and public safety, or the environment. Will treat railroads equal to highways, will say transmission lines are equal to people. I mean, it's a way of presenting it that defines what you think is priority, and then you illustrate it with elements that might fall within it. And then the second thing we learned at the workshop is what I think 4 of the workshop experts said, to keep in mind that it's the range of tools, the range of options you could choose to exercise that may be the most important thing. Politics would dictate it's the range of any list of any item that anybody thinks is important that should be expanded. For us, it's the range of options. So it may be that to protect one thing, you may find levies are 7th on the list of steps that should be taken. I mean, for example, if a life is in danger, promising to build and repair a levee that might take 3 years to complete and for which money is not available is probably not an adequate protection for that human life, right? Sounds plausible. But saying, go get a boat and have it at your house might conceivably be immediately or near immediately available and have a high level of protection. It's those kinds of gradients that are in all the work you've got, but it doesn't quite format in a way that illustrates that. And I think it's because we've got the statutory title of state investments and levies, but really what this is about is emergency response I mean, emergency response is probably as important, maybe more important than levies, because you could build a fat levee and it might overtop two. And then the levy wouldn't solve the problem, only emergency response or self-help remedies or something like that. I mean, so it's not, I don't object to the elements that are in here, but it's the order of them that allows you to systematically review and keep your options open, that to me is one of the things we're still struggling with. And I'm struggling with it. Dan and I talked for a while yesterday on exactly this point. So I think you have to have the cautions that you are saying here as part of the document, because nobody will remember this conversation at the next meeting. They will, however, or they'll refer to a flow chart or a statement of outlines, and they will see, well, gee, I guess water reliability isn't as important as all the elements under people and property. But that isn't what you're saying.
Well, and ultimately, the question is, what is the council saying? Because what we're trying to do now is just begin to craft the alternatives that you'll consider. And we're trying to do that by asking you to identify the alternatives that you think are important. Later, we're going to ask you, when we bring you some sets of levy investment alternatives, you may have the choice of saying this set of interests is more important than that, and so we're going to put our levy investment money in this, move it in this direction, in that direction. But at this stage of the game, we're just trying to make sure we understand what you think might be important, so that we've got those things under consideration, and again, what might be important to spend levy investment money on. Because certainly there are things that are important where a levy probably isn't that relevant to the protection of a resource at hand.
Just as a suggestion, I think it might be useful, whatever the council does today, for you to have a third chart of range of tools or whatever it's called to reduce risk. Because it's only with those kinds of options in mind that you can understand some of the other elements that are here. Suggestion. Thank you.
Others? Yes, Susan?
So if the basic question is in attachment to these elements listed are what the council considers should be part of this analysis, my answer is yes. And I understand the difficulty of making a list and not having it look as though it's already been prioritized with the A and the B and the, so I understand that these are elements that have not yet been ranked, and they've also not yet been embodied in what Phil was referring to, a kind of a matrix of, along with these elements, in each part of the delta, there are different situations. And I think that contextualizing would be really useful in the future as we march toward ranking.
Mayor Brown?
Well, one of my questions was actually answered by Phil's comments, but it was just really in response to the ranking and priorities. I just wanted to make sure that these weren't necessarily in a particular order. And then just specifically in terms of human life and then public health, but it would be great to identify specifically human safety, or just the safety component in terms of securing the levees, and just kind of think about that context as we continue on with investment.
Judge? There you go.
It's a little misleading. I mean, when you start with A, B, C, D, you think of priorities.
Frank, pull the mic down.
And that was confusing. I thought this was a priority list. But obviously, it's not. I don't know how you reword it or explain that, but I think it's very important to note that these are not priorities.
Ready for public comment? Okay. Eric Ringelberg is batting first.
Thank you, Chair, Council members. First, I want to thank Cindy and Dustin and the council staff in general for taking the time to meet with us and talk about these issues. Obviously, these are things that we care deeply about, and we feel that there are some readily apparent areas where multiple benefits can be met, and we can work together towards improving what we see as a really important area for the long-term protection of human health and habitat in the Delta. So I think you'll hear a lot about the statutory requirements in terms of what the state interests are. The staff's recommendation, I think, should not be taken up in terms of not considering cultural, historic, aesthetic, and recreation. Those are statutory requirements. And if the council feels that maybe they should be weighed, I think that might be more appropriate than just simply dispensing with them. But I want to talk about the two tables, because I think the two tables of alternative approaches for guiding state investment are really important, because they lay out the span that Councilmember Eisenberg was talking about. For traditional environmental analysis, you lay out alternatives that encompass framing the sideboards of the particular problem. And in this case, we feel very clearly that the alternatives don't cover the full span. They don't even cover the legal requirements, in our opinion, and we've identified that with staff. But more importantly, I think, they don't cover the span of the types of protection, the weighting for each of these different alternatives. It's not a reasonable span, and frankly, the metrics, the column on the left-hand side, we feel are artificially narrow and also fail to meet the statutes. I think a reasonable range, and Councilmember Johnson, I think I heard today also Eisenberg, want a reasonable range to be able to understand how to look at this complicated set of problems. And if you don't have a reasonable range, you end up by default ending up in the preferred alternative, which is very narrowly constrained and artificially constrained, in our opinion. So the idea that staff has put forward that the reasonable range of alternatives will be developed in the CEQA analysis seems counterintuitive. I would think that the council would like to see the full development of the alternatives, and then whatever the legal team decides and whatever the planning team decides for the CEQA analysis, that's the place to narrow it down. But in terms of public policy, you want to have the broadest range of alternatives to fully flesh out what the real potential repercussions of the various policy decisions are going to be as applied to the alternatives. So finally, the excuse that it's too difficult to quantify these items, cultural and historical assets that are not in legacy communities, is on its face incorrect. The Delta Levee strategy, which you'll hear in 11, actually tries to do that, and we think that does a reasonable approach. You can identify the resources that exist, and it's not something that should be deferred out because it seems to be too hard to do on an analysis side. You're already going forward and doing a list of island by island assets. Those assets include cultural historical features. They can also include recreational values, and they can also include aesthetic assets. So that concludes my comments.
Eric, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, Dante John Nomalini.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, it's good to see you all again. My concern is that the attachment number 2, which sets forth your interests, state what you recognize as state interests to receive further consideration in terms of developing your levee investment strategy, is artificially narrowed. And I believe it's contrary to the statutes that have clearly set out the state interests with regard to the Delta, the recreational aspects, and I'll pick the easiest one first. If you look at what staff has recommended to you, and I agree, I don't understand this as any kind of a priority determination. All this is a listing of the interests that deserve further evaluation as to how you might prioritize them or consider them. And I think at this stage, it's premature for you to narrow this down in the manner suggested by staff, and I think it also ignores some other major factors. But the easiest one to talk about is you're requested to conclude that there's no state interest that should be further considered with regard to recreation in the Delta. I think that's a gross mistake and directly contrary to many of the statutes. And I think your suggestion, Phil, that staff should list the statutory authority that describes what relates to the issue so that you have in hand what you're working against. Meandering waterways, that's a unique feature of the Delta. You don't have meandering protected waterways that somebody could go out there with a canoe or a small vessel and navigate in all of those channel fringes. In addition, this will be the first time I've seen a state entity ignore the public trust values in our navigable waterways. We deal with public trust values all the time associated with these channels adjacent to the levees, and now your people are saying they don't deserve consideration with regard to the impact of the levees, which are the shorelines of these channels. So I think it would be a gross error there. I'm going to go through just a quick litany of the items I think you've left out. I appreciate the chair and staff. They met with us a couple of times. We talked about big picture. I apologize for not being able to attend the nitty-gritty part of some of this that maybe led to this list. But under people and property and human life and safety, I think there needs to be a recognition of the Delta levees as a system, whether you want to appreciate that or not, but those of us that have worked for years with Delta levees, we know the significance of being next to a flooded island. The seepage impact and the wind fetch is increased and affects us. Water supply reliability, you listed export. We also have local water supply that should be equally considered in terms of listing, because the channels of the Delta are the supply to the islands. In terms of aqueducts and pumping plants, you've ignored the city of Stockton and Contra Costa Water District. There are two that I think, if you're going to recognize the North Bay Aqueduct and the McCollum Aqueduct, it's important to recognize these. You know, it doesn't say no others, but I think if you're going to list, you ought to list at least those that are very apparent. In terms of Western Delta Islands and other levees, it says, and other levees, I suspect that the staff does not appreciate the significance of shortening the path of salinity intrusion. In other words, if you eliminate the levee systems or levee remnants in between, and you shorten the path for salinity intrusion to come in the Delta, it will aggravate. That's the exact concern that's being addressed with Delta barriers in the drought. That is a shortening of the path. It's not just the Western Delta Islands levees, it's those levees in between that the salt water can intrude into the interior of the Delta, affecting local supply as well as export. So I think the path is significant. The other thing I think is missed is the change in the Delta prism, the tidal prism in the Delta, particularly at the lower end of the Yolo bypass. They've taken those levees down. They were in the flood bypass. They got flooded, once every 5 or 10 years, but they've taken those down now, and they've increased the tidal of the prism so that our salinity intrusion is worse, and it's also been cited as affecting the outstream migration of salmon. So I think consideration ought to be given to the tidal prism effect of what you're doing with levees. You may want to put those levees back in. And therefore, I think you at least have to list the items that you should be looking at. Evaporative losses. When we take a Delta island and we turn it into a flooded condition, let's say there's no railroad or highway on it or whatever, the evaporative losses can be upwards almost to 2 acre-feet per acre per year, additional loss of fresh water. Now that, we fight over 5 to 10,000 acre-feet of water. They had busloads of people come to the State Water Resource Control Board the other day over the issue of, I think, 5 to 9,000 acre-feet of water. So I don't think you ought to overlook the evaporative losses, and in addition to just having a surface water body, you have longer fetches, greater wind effect, which dramatically increases the evaporative loss. So, and water quality, I think you've ignored water quality. We've got salinity, we've got methylmercury, we've got dissolved organic carbon, are all issues associated with flooding those islands that should be considered. They may not determine your ultimate outcome, but they should stay on the table until you get to farther in the process. Our farmland is the wintering grounds for the Pacific Flyway. So we have the critical wintering grounds for ducks and geese in the Pacific Flyway, as well as shorebirds. Now, you cited special interest birds such as sandhill cranes and Swainson's hawks, but I think you're overlooking the significance of keeping the islands intact for the role in preserving the Pacific Flyway waterfowl. I mentioned methylmercury, the lower end of the joint. I think that's it. I think I just wanted to give you a litany of those. And again, I think it's a bad idea. Of course, you'll probably stimulate a legal fight later when you run against the statutes at the preliminary stages of this, when you get to your environmental document. Of course, we will pay close attention to how you've adhered to the statutes and what they are. So I would respectfully suggest that you not artificially narrow it at this stage. Thanks.
Thank you. Melinda Terry, and as Melinda's coming up, I want to highlight a letter received from Assembly Member Jim Frazier, who is chair of the Transportation Committee, weighing in on state interests. This letter will be posted on our website. I only have one copy, but certainly happy to. If I could read it, would legal counsel like me to read it? Pardon me?
I thought maybe if you could summarize it quickly, it might be helpful for the council in deliberating. But if not, that's I defer to the chair.
Essentially, he establishes his interest as an assembly member representing a portion of the Delta. As chair of the Transportation Committee, wants us to consider the impacts on transportation. Does not feel that any levies in support of habitat restoration that could in some way benefit, let's see, how does he benefit obligations of others, he believes those should not be a state interest.
What does that mean?
Well, let me just...
Maybe the general tenor of the letter give due respect to a member of the legislature.
Okay,
Yeah.
here's what I was trying to describe in my own words. These are his. However, paying for habitat restoration activities necessary to comply with endangered species permit obligations of the pumping facilities exporting water to beneficiaries outside the Delta is not a flood protection measure and therefore should not use limited levy funds or be included in attachment 2.
That's the argument that water exporters should pay for the cost of anything that's involved, and it's a lot more than what they're paying for now. And whatever levy money should be left for the folks who don't export water. That's the way I'd heard it. I think that's right.
I presume so. He would be here because he has a hearing.
They're voting on the budget today, an emergency budget bill today,
Yeah.
to accelerate some budget for drought and flood.
I'll pass it along for your information, and it will be posted. Melinda, welcome.
Yes, thank you. I'm a little bit hoarse from allergies. I don't know about the rest of you, but it's hit me hard this year. Melinda Terry, I'm the Executive Director of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. And my comments are similar to some of the council members as well as the speakers before me in terms of this might be, the criteria might be too narrow really at this point from a state interest standpoint. If you recall, really, the flood system that we have, the state plan of flood control, in particular, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin River systems that the Army Corps built and transferred to the state, they came first. They became a very convenient, though, water conveyance system as well, but they were, in fact, first. And there were two main reasons why the state in fact, started reclaiming land in the Delta. The federal government was doing Swamp and Overflow Act. California said, yeah, we want to participate. And the two reasons we want to participate, one was health and one was economic. The health reason was when you have a swampland, they had really serious public health problems with malaria because of the mosquito breeding that happens in the swamplands. In the Delta, when we get a lot of water too, we've also had West Nile deaths occur. So the vector control is an example of something they really have to, it ends up changing the county's costs that have to apply if you're going to deal with the public health. The other economic reason, of course, was the farming. The state really wanted to make money, and reclaiming the land for farming was the other reason. Other public health I would add in would be things like I didn't really see protecting things like hospitals or the emergency services themselves. And that could be anywhere from the fired houses themselves, or really sometimes it's the road system, because there are certain roads for the emergency vehicles. If you've all been in the Delta, man, you cut off one road, it's a long way around. You know, ambulances are a good example for somebody, heart attack or something, that golden hour can really make a difference. And if we have a flood event, the ability to evacuate the fastest way possible. So some of those roads are not just highways, they're county roads, but they're very critical to being able to not only get our emergency people there to flood fight, the crews, but for people to evacuate. So I encourage you to think about that. And then just from a state interest perspective, yeah, I kind of agree with Dante in particular that I used to work at the agency, the resources agency, so it's fairly easy for me to think about what, you know, DWR, what state interests, what the water board state interests might be, what yours are. And it feels like it hasn't quite captured the other mission, objectives, and regulations or plans, and particularly strategic plans that other folks have, like the Delta Protection Commission. They were created to protect the primary zone in particular. So that's something that really needs to be looked at because they have some statutory obligations there that, to do that, as well as some other things in their land management plan dealing with the levees themselves. Other agencies, for example, that have issues that, you know, really need to be thought about more, in particular for this type of criteria, are the other agencies that really have primary flood responsibilities. So the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, the legislature has already spoken and given a lot of direction on what we're supposed to be doing with flood. And so the state developed the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And so there are things in there, because like things like saying we're going to protect human life, I guess part of it is how are you going to do that? It's the mechanism, the tools. I think Mr. Eisenberg brought up tools. So does that mean we're going to prioritize doing, for instance, the 200-year level of protection for the urban areas in the Delta that the state legislature requires in statute to be done by 2025? That's a state interest because, one, the legislature said, you know, we want that to be done, but two, there are severe economic consequences for those areas. They end up with building moratoriums, as Natomas has had, if they don't meet that objective. So from a state, in my perspective, that might be a priority. And you mentioned kind of the flood system, but really don't name the state plan of flood control. That is actually really, really important because it's very specific facilities for which the state has given the federal government assurances that they will operate and maintain. And yesterday I attended the coordinating committee for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. We meet every month, and I really encourage the consultants and staff working on this to go to that in particular because there was some really good information that I think that will help you. So for instance, yesterday it was a presentation on our recent technical memo where they've spent a lot of time, DWR and the consultants, going out and trying to put some costs to deferred maintenance, if you will. And essentially the deferred maintenance is becoming so serious in that system, and those levees are 1/3 of the levees in the Delta, that it actually is an urgent life and safety issue because of the maintenance deference at this point. And they speculated that we needed to spend like $83 million a year. Of course, that's the whole system from, Red Bluff to Fresno. And we're only spending about $27 million. And a lot of that needs to be spent, frankly, in the bypasses themselves to do sediment and vegetation management. And that's where I do get concerned about, over time, what we're really talking about at that meeting. And they put unit costs, by the way, to some of this maintenance, and that's what I thought might be helpful to you guys, is they've done some of the work for you. That will be helpful. But we're looking at really dwindling flood resources at this point, because Prop 1E is running out, and there was very little flood money put in Prop 1. And unless a Katrina-type event or a flood in Sacramento itself happens, we won't see a flood-only bond like Prop 1E. So with dwindling funds, it is really important to make sure that the prioritization is focus on reducing flood protection. And earlier today, you had a presentation by your legal intern about a Proposition 218 case, and I've spoken about this issue before. Those items in C, if they're in the FERPA agreement, those are part of obligations that exist for water supply. They're not flood projects. They're not for flood protection. And so we're not really allowed ourselves to charge for it. I can absolutely understand why it would be a state priority, and why B, we want to do the levees to protect the water conveyance getting to them, though. That is a very big state interest. The habitat projects that they're required to do because of the harm that their pumping costs is different, though, and it's not flood. And so we do worry about that, particularly with the dwindling revenues. There's certainly the ability to partner up with them as you do flood projects, but you need to find a different funding source, I guess, would be my suggestion. The other interesting thing about yesterday was they actually were talking about kind of modeling after the Delta Subventions program for rural districts all throughout the system, because it is such a good program that does a good job of really every year trying to focus on what are our critical maintenance, life and safety that need to be done this year, and getting those done. And then I think I did those. Oh, one other thing I will mention is, and it got brought up yesterday, and I've talked about this before, is it's the liability that sometimes occurs. And there was the Upper San Joaquin consultant gave a presentation yesterday. In 2006, they had a levee failure, and of course the local agencies were all sued, and the county, the city, and the district each paid $6 million for a total of $18 million. Well, they have a $20 million project that they need to do to actually protect the Manteca. But now they had to spend it on a settlement lawsuit, and that was their emergency funds. They don't even have funds to do a lot of maintenance at this point. So that's why maintenance gets so critical, because you kind of have to wonder, well, how well maintained was it when it failed? So being able to keep up with those is really, really important for us to have then the money to spend on that activity. I am going to mention just one last thing, which is in a different attachment, which is the staff report. It defines water quality as protection for fish. And that was really concerning to me, because the levee system is very, very critical on maintaining water quality in the Delta. So we've got drinking water, we have ag water and municipal use going on all throughout here. And so the levee system, as you change those, for instance, installation of the barriers is the good example. When those are installed, the salinity starts going up into an area it wouldn't otherwise, which is Cache Slough. So you get that whole Ryer Island, Hastings, 2068, the North Bay Aqueduct, drinking water, that gets impacted. So the configuration really has a big deal to the water quality. And again, going back to other statutes and requirements, we have a California Water Action Plan and the California Water Plan, and talking about the integrated regional water management plans. And in the Delta, they're doing those and have those, and we need to make sure that the investment in levees is helping them protect that along the way. Thank you.
Eric Vink, Delta Protection Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. I'll be brief. A lot of the comments have been covered by the previous two speakers. We would have the similar concerns about excluding Delta unique values. Those are really the heart of National Heritage Area type values, which of course is part of the Delta plan and something we're trying to see enacted and put into place throughout the Delta. And just to also second the comment that Mr. Ringelberg had made, and I was troubled by this as well, this notion that these, in addition to we don't think they should be considered, these more qualitative features don't have sufficient information to be able to quantify risk and benefits to those elements. And I think that's the case for a lot of what's on this list. They're inherently qualitative factors. It's just, you just have to dig a little bit deeper to determine how to put the right price or the right cost on those features. So I would urge you to move away from that line of reasoning. I think it's a bad direction to be headed down, and certainly affects a whole host of other factors as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, John Lopez.
Hello. Excuse me. Okay, I'd like to limit my comments to the levies and levy integrity. In particular, the means for distinguishing one decision or the value of one decision over another, in particular the consequences versus the conditions of the levies. We've examined more than 1,000 line miles of levees in the Delta and hundreds of miles of the Sacramento River and San Joaquin, as well as rivers along the levees along the Mississippi. And in that geophysical examination, we've discovered all sorts of anomalies that you wouldn't ordinarily find in a particular model for levee integrity or the effects of the hydrodynamics on the levee themselves. What I'm particularly concerned about are things that, for example, on the levees we found very unusual items. We found we could see beaver dens, we could see the tunnels of beaver dens. Along the Mississippi, we could see that kids were digging into the levees to make houses out of them. We also saw portions of the levees that were excavated to widen yards. In the Delta, we've also found a vehicle buried inside a levee as well as a boat inside of a levee. The construction of levees are pretty haphazard in the Delta when you start comparing them to these major river levees. Another concern I have about when I've heard talk about fat levees is that one of the levees in the Delta, at least a portion of it, is so heavy that it's actually sinking in the substrate and causing the center part of the island to break away from its base. So it's kind of like a lead donut around the edge of the island, pushing up the center. There are consequences like that that I don't know if it's part of the models or whether it affects a consequence versus a condition. But at some point, if you don't consider enough detail, enough fine-grained elements in the decision-making process, you're going to come up with a solution that where you have one fix for all sorts of conditions, and some of those fixes can have consequences that you just wouldn't ordinarily anticipate, such as you might find in the Delta. So I guess with that, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next up, Kim Tremaine, Tremaine and Associates.
Hi. I have a lot of thoughts going around in my head, so I hope I don't sound discombobulated or just not coming out fully. But regarding cultural resources, that's been brought up a few times in discussion tonight or today, and I am actually a cultural resources manager. I wasn't even planning on talking about that today, but it is something that has come up recently along the Feather River. If any of you are aware of the problems that have happened there, where they actually did defer identification of cultural resources before they started doing some rehab and degrading the levees and then coming into old Native American burial grounds, and it's just created a huge mess where the Native Americans are threatening to, have an injunction against the Sutter Buttes Flood Control Board. And so there's a big issue regarding cultural resources, not even regarding, I can't possibly quantify that ahead of time, which there are ways that you can, but in addition to being able to quantify and just the statute of it, there are hazards regarding cultural resources because a lot of times the levees in those areas are the weakest because for whatever reason the water can penetrate through that soil easier. So it's in the interest of the Delta Stewardship Council to actually identify where those sites are for that reason, because it could be a hazard. So that's just one thing. And hope that came across okay. But I have not been in all these meetings, so I'm not sure where everybody is in the process of evaluating the levees for integrity so that they can then prioritize how they invest in, building them up. I know in the National Levee Safety Program, they talk about getting this base condition risk assessment done beyond just doing routine inspections and periodic inspections. And that base condition risk assessment, I know has been done for the federal levees or the urban levees, but I don't know where in the Delta those evaluations are, if those base condition assessments have been made. But even if those base condition risk assessments have been made, and I'd like hopefully to open up the question about that, then what level of, how were they made basically? So the National Levee Safety Program talks about doing total conditional performance as a way of assessing the levees, which has everything to do with the probability of failure. And until you actually know what that probability of failure is, plus your degree of uncertainty regarding that probability of failure, you can't even go into what the risk of life, limb, and property is because you're not well informed. So one of the things I noted when the urban levees were when those base conditions were being made for the urban levees is that it was very straight across the board, doing geotechnical analysis every 1,000 feet, trying to then extrapolate between and look at the integrity of those levees on a very general scale, when in reality there's a lot of heterogeneity and there's probably a lot of weaknesses in between. And in order to identify those weaknesses, which is where the levees are going to break, you've got to go beyond your standard general assessment methods. And I've given lots of papers at these infrastructure conferences for the Society of Military Engineers, and I was involved with the International Levee Handbook, trying to get some of these ideas across that it is possible to identify where these weaknesses are. It takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of doing historical research to find out maybe where the levees broke in the past, because where they broke in the past, especially when the way of repairing those levee breaks in the past was not the way they're done today. They used wood piles and brush, and all that stuff has been decaying, and over time, that's where there's going to be a weakness, and until you identify where that is, that's going to break. And if you've done your geotechnical bore every 1,000 feet and you missed that break, you've missed the whole point. And so I guess I'm trying to find out from you in my rambling way, what where are you at with your evaluations? And then if you're at that general stage of evaluation where it's every 1,000 feet you've done a geotechnical bore, that I think it's important to identify gaps in the data. And the gaps in the data in this case are finding those localized weaknesses. And I think there are ways to get to those localized weaknesses. And so I guess that's where I'm at right now, to talk about that and then ask where you guys are at with evaluating your levies.
Okay, thank you for those comments. I have one more blue slip. Tom, would you like to speak? Tom Zuckerman, Central Delta Water Agency.
I am Tom Zuckerman, and you may have noticed that I represent the same agency that Mr. Nomalini does. And I'm not here because I disagree with anything he said, but I just wanted to make come at this from a slightly different direction. I absolutely agree with him that you're on thin ice if you start eliminating as things of benefits in the Delta that the legislature on multiple occasions has said are matters of statewide interest. And I think going down the path that way is the wrong approach to this. What you'll find out, because other efforts that preceded you by a number of years have found it out, that when you start looking at all the various beneficial interests that are involved in this, it becomes quite a jumble, because you can't look at an individual island and find that, a bare situation. There's always 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different things that are involved there, and having a list of things that you're going to protect and not protect is just going to confuse you as you go along. The constructive comments I wanted to make is I think your consultant is kind of on the right track here. The concept of tolerable risk is maybe a better way to approach this thing, and it's pretty much the way historically the flood protection has been approached, both locally, statewide, and nationally. And you're all familiar with the concept of having a 100-year levee. Well, that means you've got a levee that has a chance of breaking one in every 100 years. If you have a 50-year levee, it's 50 years. If it's 200 years, it's 200 years. And there are some value judgments that are being made behind the engineering that goes into deciding whether this should have 50-year protection, 100-year protection, or 200-year protection. I do think it's possible for you to go through the Delta and look at individual islands and say, what is our risk tolerance given the assets that are protected in a specific location? That's the way we've approached it through the levee programs before. The PL 8499 standard for agricultural protection is a 50-year standard. And that means that we are accepting the idea that we could tolerate a flood here twice in a century. The standard that was set up recently for the urban communities is a 200-year standard, and that basically is saying we could tolerate the risk of having one failure in 200 years. And that tends to bleed out the differences between these various values that we're trying to protect. We start with the idea that this is a levee system. You've heard from me several times on this before, and I won't beat the live horse in this case, that you really need to have some basic level of protection for the islands because they operate as a system, and once it begins to deteriorate, all hell breaks loose immediately or over some period of time. So start with that. There's a tolerable risk level, which we think is PL 8499, and there's good reason to accept that in the sense that Mr. Eisenberg has talked at some length before about the state's liability for flood risk and so forth, and having the federal government behind the repair of levees and prevention of floods is very important to reducing the state's risk in that arena. So you need to have as your basic level of protection something like that that will enable the federal government to come in and help the state repair something. So that's where it should start. Then you can look at these individual areas, these individual islands, and see what other assets are protected. And you can arrive at a reasonable, tolerable risk situation for that. They're definable. We know, for instance, that, or we're told, I'm sure we know, that if we had a massive levee failure in the western delta, Southern California water supply in storage is enough to last for 6 months, 2 years, whatever the case might be. That gives you a way of measuring tolerable risk. We know that if a levee breaks around a populated area, that you don't have much tolerance for that kind of risk. Mr. Stevens might survive a little bit longer than I would, but you know, it's measurable as to how real the risks are, and you can figure out some way how long, you know, you can tolerate it. And I think that's a much more fruitful approach to this problem than trying to go through and decide what you're going to protect and what you're not going to protect. That's just going to confuse you in the long run. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Any other blue slips, Keith?
Randy, I think I marked mine 11 and it should be 10.
Okay. Regine Reynolds, South Delta landowner.
Thank you. And if you think Tom Zuckerman has a problem with the flood, you ought to be in my shoes. My name is Regine Reynolds. I live in the South Delta. I have just a few comments today. I'm passing around a handout. It includes a letter and an aerial view of Reclamation District 544, where I live. I'll read you the letter first and then make a few comments after. Dear council members, although you are charged with prioritizing levies based upon relative importance to the state of California, it's unlikely you have been on the ground in many Delta locations. This letter and the attachments are to show you what's at stake. The area photo is of Reclamation District 544, Upper Roberts Island, and the view is representative of much of the South Delta. Family farms and lands located above sea level. Upper Roberts is 8,260 acres, protected by, it should be 10 miles of project levees and 4.4 miles of non-project levees. Upper Roberts has not flooded since reclamation in the 1870s. I'm not convinced that the value of this community can be quantified by a computer model. Rather, I urge you to raise this council's awareness of areas such as Upper Roberts by your own personal investigation. You're invited to come to the South Delta and learn who and what we are. Like most of the Delta, we are not a legacy community, but we are a community. And this land is our legacy to the generations which will follow. I attached today to that aerial this interesting concept of the eco-friendly future Delta. Draw your attention down to the bottom right, and I noted where RD 544 is, and that it's scheduled to become a managed floodplain like the Yolo bypass. Ladies and gentlemen, we have never been anything like the Yolo bypass. So I don't know whose vision this is. I just came across it today as really unsettling, very disturbing, and I don't believe that that can be your vision as the stewards of our Delta, that we would not live there anymore. I only have a couple of comments on your recommendations from the staff, and one of them is that in your people and property discussion, you have as a in bullet property and businesses. And I ask you, why isn't agriculture included there? Is it not a business? It's only a business. Business with millions of dollars of investment. So under people and property, I would urge you to put property businesses, including agriculture. So I guess that concludes my comments. I don't think you're ready for this list yet. You haven't been on the ground. Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, any further public comment? I think this would probably be a good chance, staff, if you would like to provide some response to these thoughtful comments.
Well, you know, this is one of those days when it's easier to be at the staff table than the podium, because you faced this before when we tried to talk about delta levies, and it's not going to go away as long as we're trying to get through this process. It all begins with a point Melinda made, and that is that the demands for resources, for improvements and maintenance of the flood program continue to grow, and the resources are shrinking. We've got, as we've discussed with you more than a few times, several $1 billion of needs for flood control improvements, not accounting for the billions for maintenance that Melinda talked about within the Delta alone, and of course billions more in the state and federal flood control systems above the Delta. And we know we can't meet it all. And so it is all about how are we going to set priorities. And of course, the Delta levy priorities included in the Delta plan now and that have guided the Delta levy programs for many times say, you know, it's all important. And it is all important. But the question for you're going to have to decide is it important enough that we're going to decide to spend state levy money on it? And ultimately, if we're going to have a Delta plan that provides guidance about investment as opposed to a Delta plan that makes false promises or avoids hard decisions, priorities need to be set. And so what we're hoping to do today is begin to focus in on those. I just wanted to respond to a few additional detailed comments. You know, I wouldn't begin to try to suggest that Mr. Nomalini or Mr. Zuckerman know less about Delta levies than I do. I'm certainly got a long tradition in it, but I want to make clear that it is not our suggestion to ignore public trust values. You know, our identification of our reference to not considering among the potential priorities levy investments should further aesthetics assets. We relied on the meandering levees, which is the example, meandering waterways. That's the example in the current Delta levy guidelines. That's one of the examples that's given. You know, if you think that you would consider spending levy investment money to protect aesthetics as opposed to fish and wildlife habitats, which we've identified, or channels as an important natural resource, which we've identified among the Delta unique values, then you could consider that and keep it there. You know, we can try to find a way to make it work. That particular resource is more difficult because there isn't a good aesthetic analysis of the Delta that's available that's ready to use. But if that is something you think, yeah, we might do that, that's important. And then we'll keep it in. You know, similarly with recreation, we've checked with the Department of Water Resources levy staff, and they're unable to identify a time during their careers when levy investment was made in the Delta primarily to further a recreational objective. In fact, we usually hear that, of course, levees are poor places for recreation because it invites trespass and vandalism, and so people shouldn't be allowed to recreate on levees. But if you think that, yeah, we should consider investing in levees, that might be something we would do just for a recreational purpose or primary for recreational purpose. We can keep it in. As Eric pointed out, we've got a good inventory of what the recreation assets of the Delta are. But ultimately, difficult priorities are going to have to be set, and we're trying to begin that process now. And we can certainly fulfill our statutory obligations, both under the Reform Act, which requires that the Delta plan further the co-equal goals and protect the Deltas in place. But the levy investment provisions, I think you have substantial discretion about how you make sure that happens. we understand that delta levees affect water quality in many ways, and so we know that more than just the western islands are important. We know it's about delta tidal hydrodynamics as well. In other conditions, we're relying on a great deal of modeling information that the Department of Water Resources has developed to understand how changes in delta levees would affect both water quality at the pumps, for example, as well as water quality for in-delta users. So we're not oblivious to these considerations. But again, if there's other things that you think should be added to the list, I heard consideration of what you might think of as critical facilities, fire departments and hospitals and police stations, as well as evacuation corridors. You know, that might be something you might look at that list and say, gee, that should be there. It's part of protecting human life, and I think that was our consideration. But if there's other things you want to add, we can do that as well. But ultimately, priorities are going to have to be set. We can't serve everybody, even though we understand it's important. Things are important to them. Anything else needs to be said?
Oh, I'm sorry, Susan, go ahead. I just wanted to clarify just two of the minor points that were brought up by the public comments. I just wanted to reassure Melinda. She mentioned the coordinating committee yesterday. We did get some documents that were attachments in those meetings, and we do think those will be valuable, and we actually pass those along to our consultants. So the information that is coming out of those coordinating committee meetings, we do try to stay in touch with those and do see the value of that, so we do recognize that. Just briefly for Kim Tremaine, I believe might have been the last name, but regarding the base conditions, some of that I think may be touched on if Kim's able to stick around for the next agenda item. Some of the risks may be touched on, that might be valuable. And just a reference to the DWR's Delta Risk Management Strategy for some of the supporting information that we're using. Just some of that information might be useful.
All right.
Okay, and I would just add very quickly, I wanted to recognize the comments from Ms. Tremaine and Mr. Lopez, and want to commit to following up with them. I think we could have some discussion to kind of get them up to speed where the technical side of things are, because they brought up some very good points, things we have been thinking about and looking at. So I just wanted to put that out there. And just thank you to the folks that provided comments today. I think there were some very good suggestions. And I think along with the comments we have received so far from the council members, we have some good direction in clarifying ways we're packaging some of the information and how we're defining certain things. So I just want to say thank you, and we appreciate that. So.
Okay. So, council, what's your pleasure? Susan?
I just have a clarifying question. Staff. So given this list of considerations, and given what folks have said, especially what Mr. Zuckerman said about, trying to isolate benefits, and each island will have a set of benefits. It's my understanding that the decision analysis tool will be able to analyze entire portfolios of benefits, and we're not doing this island by island, but we're doing actual polygons and sets of islands. So just something to think about. Perhaps we do not need to, and I know this is not a priority list, but since we have a decision analysis tool that enables you to look at the sets of benefits in each polygon, we could do the kind of analysis where you include everything on the list, including the cultural and meandering, and you see the extent of overlap of all these different benefits in each set of polygons, and that allows you to see through various overlays in different parts of the delta the maximum amount of all of these interests, all these benefits, and that'll give you a broader picture, and combined with the tolerable risk and the weighting of these sets of benefits, as long as we don't double count them,
right,
we should be able to see a pattern. And I also want to make the point that when we're talking about investment, it's over a long period of time. It's not as though the state's going to say, these are our priority polygons, and we're going to spend all the money here, and this polygon gets the majority of the money first, there will be some sort of ranking of amounts of state funding also, I'm assuming. And I don't know how you can convey all that in a very simple document, but
Yes, that is the difficulty.
might give it a try.
Okay, and I thank you. I think that was very helpful and a great way to summarize what we've been presenting to various technical groups. Maybe just one caveat, and this kind of goes back to my presentation about wanting to be able to come back to the council as we move along and we're looking at these different interests and these different values. Honoring what Eric Vink said in terms of there is degrees of quantitative information out there, but recognizing that that is part of what we need to work through for these various interests, and we'll come back, and in some cases it might be more clear-cut than others, but that will be something we'll have to wrestle with, is how do we bring all these together, given what type of information might be available. So,
Should the council decide that you think the cultural and historical assets ought to remain on the list as a priority or a state interest that levy investments ought to further, that much of that information is available. Information about burial sites we'll never be able to share in the public and may never be shared with us as the staff. That's always kind of under wraps. Recreation interests, again, those are easily identified. Almost all of them are on the water side of the levee. So I think that was the reason that we thought, well, they're probably not warrant further consideration in this situation. Aesthetic assets that Eric and I have talked about, as I've traded information with his staff as recently as last week. And of course, the meandering waterways was just the example the Department of Water Resources gave about aesthetic assets of the Delta, but we can think of many things we like about the aesthetics of the Delta. Historic homes along a particular channel, or older homes are probably not on a national register anyplace. Attractive landscaping, palm trees that line farm lanes, all of us have our favorite features. But in discussions with both the DPC staff and the Conservancy staff, as well as reaching out to landscape architects who've worked extensively in the Delta, there isn't a comprehensive analysis of the aesthetic assets of the Delta, and so that would be a much more challenging piece to use in the tool.
Patrick, and then the judge.
For staff, or maybe if Tom Zuckerman would want to clarify. So I understand, Tom, what you suggested was that there be a baseline state subvention program or support for all levies in the Delta at a minimum of 50-year standard. And then beyond that, a evaluation and judgment about tolerance for risk and taking into account the different values and size of communities and so forth. But did I get that right? Is that your current articulation?
Yeah, and I've said it before, and what I didn't include this time is that when you find those extra interests that you're trying to protect, sometimes there's a contribution aspect to it that's appropriate, to protect the pipeline or to protect the power line or the railroad or the water conveyance and so forth. So it can broaden the financial base that you're talking about to go to some higher risk tolerance or lower risk tolerance level. Because you're going to have some other people contributing a portion of the cost, hopefully.
So, Dan Ray started with a reminder about the limited resources and the large need. Is it your recommendation that this minimum 50-year flood standard should have the highest priority, and what's left, if there is money left, should go into other opportunities or needs?
I don't think that's the way it can work. We have a fairly limited capacity. If you told us you wanted to go out through the state special projects or the subventions program and bring every Delta levy up to to PL 8499,
Right.
it would take us a considerable period of time to get that done because of limitations of local ability to contribute, equipment, knowledgeable people, et cetera, regulatory permits and so forth. So I don't think all the money should be spent on any one aspect of this. I think various programs to deal with the different levels of risk tolerance need to go on simultaneously, and recognizing that the horizon for getting this all done is long, and then there's maintenance and so forth. So it not only be long, it may be never ending.
Right. So what I conclude is that you're arguing for a value of a base level of support over time that would assist reclamation districts reach this minimum standard that might be good for them, might be good for the Delta, might be good for the state's interest, and might yield federal funds should there be a flood. And you haven't dismissed, in fact, you've underscored the value of many other needs in the Delta and suggested there may be some additional funds. Isn't it true that we have a $3 billion need and a $300 million fund?
If you're talking about the 50-year protection, I don't think it's anywhere close to $3 billion.
No, I don't think so either. But if you add, many of the other needs that rise above the 50-year level, it's just that your suggestion kind of works if there is an expansive or expandable funding source that's dependable. But absent that, how do we not try to figure out how to spend those limited dollars? I think you're saying don't tie yourselves down or tie DWR or anybody else down and take into account this value of a baseline support and these other opportunities, go after other money when you can, and then essentially the process should be the same as it is today, which is kind of case by case.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can accept the limited amount of funds because I think there are other sources of funding, as I've tried to suggest, when you start talking about higher levels of protection. I think you're going to get into the urban protection funding formulas. You're going to get into situations where East Bay Mud wants to protect their pipeline. You're going to get into situations where the state water contractors want to protect the conveyance routes through the Delta and so forth. And I believe that there is money behind those things if you look at them closely enough.
Well, East Bay Mud did it by getting a legislative specified authorization out of a bond measure, did it not?
Yes, but they made a very significant contribution to those projects.
But
from
they in fact jumped any evaluation of competing needs in favor of getting the legislature to commit some monies to that project.
Well, as a former member of the legislature, isn't that what you're doing every day? Is
I was shocked.
Evaluating those needs? Thank you.
Okay, Judge, and then Mayor Brown.
Given this recent colloquy by my friend Senator Johnston and Mr. Zuckerman, and some thoughtful comments that have been made by folks in the audience, I nevertheless understand this has been a fairly seriously analyzed and discussed strategy in terms of what the elements where the state interest would be. I mean, that, obviously, a lot of thought's been given to this. But I'm bothered by the fact there are no priorities here. And does that mean that we can't think about this and take it up at the next meeting, or it's an action item, so I assume that there's a reason for that. Is there a time constraint on us now to get this done today?
It's certainly important that we get guidance on the range of interests you want considered, and do that now, because we're trying to help our consultants prepare the materials that they need to submit to the peer review panel, which is meeting in May.
Okay.
So that work needs to be done prior to your next council meeting. Now, we're not asking you to set priorities, of course, because that'll come later when we actually understand more about the system. As Mr. Zuckerman pointed out, and it's good to hear him that he appreciates this approach that our consultants are bringing. What's the tolerance for risk? But the question is, risk to what? And we may have a different tolerance for risk to an archaeological site, or if we think archaeological sites are important, than we would to the drinking water supply for 2/3 of California, or to a farm we own versus a farm somebody else owns, or to interruption of electrical transmission systems through the county. So that's really what we're trying to get at today. What are the assets that might be put at risk if a levee were to fail that are important to the council? And later we'll come back when we understand better the condition of levees, the probability that things might fail, how assets tier up on different islands, to work with you to develop a set of priorities in consultation with stakeholders that you think further the important state interests.
Well, there are some very, very general comments in your recommendation. I mean, you talk about waterfowl, and someone mentioned the fact that, well, you talk about sandhill cranes. Well, I mean, waterfowl covers a big universe. My question, I guess, really is this, you're giving us basically a universe of interests here. Is that it in your mind? I mean, you've thought about this and given thought to it, and you've heard what was said today. Do you see any reason to reconsider the universe that you've given us?
Well, I think, perhaps we didn't make it clear enough in writing this up that the essential public facilities and services, such as hospitals and evacuation routes and police stations, are an important aspect of protecting life, and so I think we would include those, within our consideration. I hadn't. That's a good point, because I think you would always put those as a high priority, just as we did water and wastewater plants. But I think otherwise, I think what we've heard today, we've heard before, and it's not news, and I think we're very comfortable with where we're at.
I suspect that is the case, but I think there's enough general language in there that probably encompasses virtually everything that has been said, with maybe that exception. That's just my sense.
Mayor Brown?
Thank you. I'll be brief. Some of the audience comments regarding risk management are some of the things that we've discussed in the past, just about protecting the Delta as a system and really being able to assess a baseline in terms of what investment is necessary for the system to be maintained as a whole. And when we think about human life, public health, regional infrastructure, all of those things are really in context of risk management. And maybe just a categorical recommendation for people and property would just be risk mitigation or risk management. Because I think just from the public's perspective, they may not necessarily associate what's listed here with that actual item, which is really, I think, what you all were really compiling the list thinking of. In terms of human life, it could be very vague, but a lot of the comments that were discussed in the audience were really about connecting the two, and I think that they were already connected, so that would just be a recommendation. In terms of considering how we incentivize additional investment, I think that that's important to consider, because when we think about investment, it shouldn't be just a dollar-for-dollar investment. I know that there are some counties or there are some water districts that have bonded or they've pledged or generated certain funds to be able to make certain investments to their systems. But if we can consider this as almost like a stimulation fund to also make an incentive for local investment or localized investment into their own system. And I know that one of the speakers discussed that it's it's difficult, it's not impossible, but it's difficult to really assess the exact condition of the delta just because of the investments that were made at different times, the technology has changed and all of those types of things. But if we considered creating a way that we can incentivize local districts or areas to actually do their own assessment up to a certain threshold or standard that we predetermine, then they would basically help self-assess, and we can compile that data in a way that will help us really make the decisions that we need to make. When we think about, for instance, with risk management and floods, if there was a way for us to utilize our funds also to incentivize certain localities to do the necessary assessments, and maybe the outcome will be that there would be a prioritized FEMA response or some type of assistance from the federal government. So I always think about how we could link federal resources with state and also local. So I think that we should consider these funds as a way to really stimulate and also to provide the type of activity that needs to happen, because we know we don't have all the money we need to really secure the entire system. But if there's a way that we could think about these funds in pockets that could stimulate certain specific type of investment that we need to occur in order to achieve our co-equal goals. And that was in relation to the PLA 499 compliance. And lastly, I have notes all over the place, I'm sorry. And just in terms of just formatting, I know it's impossible to compile a list without having some perceived notion of priority or importance. So I love matrix formats or tables, and I think as we continue to evolve and have this discussion, that if we could really assign a way to graphically depict the priorities and how they overlap to achieving the co-equal goals, but also in context of risk, and then also in relation to how one particular priority may have a secondary impact to other priorities and how they can be linked together. Because I know that when we talked about just the importance of, and the recommendation to not abandon, for instance, aesthetic values or meandering waterways, while that may not necessarily preserve life, there is some type of intrinsic importance in how, if we could somehow connect different priorities with others, we may not be able to necessarily say, well, we would spend dollars, protecting or enhancing meandering waterways, but if there's an investment in a particular type of priority area that may provide some secondary or offsetting impacts to achieve those goals, then we will be open to supporting those activities. So I just think of ways to kind of use these funds as a stimulus fund to really be able to guide the type of investment at the state and local level that we need to have. Because I just wouldn't assume that since we have, a few $1 billion that we're just going to spend it dollar for dollar. I think it should be mandated that we use these funds to stimulate a return on investment of different thresholds, and that should really guide how we spend the state's money.
Thank you. That's a real good point. One of the things we've talked about, where there's sort of 3 steps in this process, and the final step is considering cost share allocations.
Okay.
And so that'll be a time we can go through, and as Mr. Zuckerman's pointed out, for urban levies, we're likely to have a substantial federal share in some cases, not for the rural levies, or maybe rural levies or the water projects or the railroads or the gas fields want to bring extra money to the table. There may be places where landowners should make a larger contribution than they are today, and other places where they don't have much ability to pay, and we can run through some of those issues a little further down the road.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I very quickly would add that we will be able to, as we go through this process, provide more visualization of, using this decision support tool that we're developing, the information that's going in. We'll be able to come back to you with more graphical representation and allow you to see where some of the trade-offs are, see where the assets are on different islands, and this groupings of investments. So you'll have to stay tuned for now, but that is our intention, to bring things back to you like that.
Other council comments?
I think you're going to wind up coming back to us with a list of prefatory statements that outline a council policy and then get to the detail. And I'll just tell you what I've been noodling around. I think you have to start with a statement that says essentially that the protection of life, property, and state interest in the Delta require a mix of actions, of which levies is one possible action, but not the only action, and often not the most significant action in terms of either protecting those interests or the cost to the state taxpayers. Number two, you're going to wind up saying a levy policy exists in the context of disaster planning, disaster response, disaster preparedness, and land use measures. And it cannot stand on its own. Number three, I think you have to make clear it's a state strategy, and nothing currently and nothing that is being done here prevents property owners from paying for their own protection at the highest level they would wish. On operational principles, I would argue to you the first is that we have a current, the state of California, the people of the state of California, have a current legal obligation to what we call project levies, both within the Delta and some, maybe there's some in the Suisun Marsh, but also alluded to the interconnected and interrelated Central Valley Flood Authority territory. And particularly for those portions of the project levies that protect larger urban properties where the consequences of failure are higher both in terms of loss of life, injury, and property damage. This is for current liability. That should be the first funding of the state of California. The second thing that occurs to me is a direct statement that the state currently has no legal obligation for non-project levies, nor should it agree to such legal obligations. Number three, the state should continue the existing program, the voluntary discretionary, levy subvention program, in an amount determined by the legislature to be appropriate, but it must remain discretionary funds and not directly or indirectly lead to an assumption of liability by the state of California. And probably the fourth is to point out that given the realities of financing and the clear withdrawal of the federal government of any interest in paying a meaningful share, certainly in the Delta, Corps of Engineers has said it very directly, we have no interest in non-project levies. I think you have to say that there has to be a maximum state limit to the state contribution, which cannot be exceeded. And it is going to be considerably higher than the one that exists now, which is, one DWR report said essentially 8% local share. That is simply cannot continue, particularly as the feds back away from their financial participation. And there are a bunch of other things that fit in that category. But until you lay that stuff out, it's hard to get past the mechanics of, here are all the elements, you have to take care of every element and so on. You got to put it in the context first in fairly clear form. Now that's deeply controversial. The people who spoke here today, not all, but most would oppose that. That's my view of what we were being asked to do, painful as it is. And I think rather than doing it in the context of a matrix discussion or anything else, it's take the bullet points. You know what some of those would be, and it's reflected in the document you've got here. By the way, this is really a I would argue to you is almost a reorganization of what you've already done as opposed to brand new. I mean, for example, you have listed as items of importance infrastructure, that is within the delta or passes through the delta, gas, natural gas, transmission lines, and so on, railroads. If they pay anything at all to be protected today, it is by matter of imperial grace from those entities as opposed to a legal responsibility. That is without any coherent explanation or defensible explanation. The owners of railroads, the owners of utility lines, of power lines, of gas lines, and of water lines that are protected, are arguably crossing the delta, are not simply state levels of protection. They are also responsibilities of the people who own, operate those systems. And so the notion, it's part of our Delta plan, that the Public Utilities Commission start by imposing a requirement on regulated utilities that they maintain some level of flood protection, assisting the locals in the state in whatever program exists, so that the costs can be spread more easily, becomes a foundational principle. I'd argue to you things we've already talked about. A flood protection emergency response assessment district, which did get a little traction in the legislature, is being discussed by the Delta Protection Commission and others, absolutely essential to any rational kind of big change in the Delta. And you just ought to get on with that issue. Those are the kind of preamble stuff that start to give a more coherent structure, I think, Dan, to what then becomes the methodology you apply. And I don't, that's what I think you're going to wind up doing. I think it's the only way to give some structure to this that we can work with.
You're right, Phil. That's right.
So we have a staff recommendation to adopt attachment 2. What would you like to do with that staff recommendation?
Phil, what is your,
I think,
what is it, I mean?
okay, here,
It makes a lot of sense to me, but I mean,
to me, part of the problem is that we're hiding what are policy judgments we know are out there. I'd be astonished, given the statutory language which says nothing in the Delta Protection Act expands state legal liability, and the concern about funding, I'd be astounded if the council would recommend that we take over, state should take over financial responsibility for all levies in the Delta. Although that would be, in fact, the only understandable thing that would be out there. But of course, the minute the state takes it over, the costs don't stay at $400 million or $3 billion. You know, the sky's the limit once you say, I'm legally responsible. So Frank, I think the staff has identified many, maybe not all, but many of the elements that are there. What we haven't done is put it in context, and more importantly, we haven't had a realistic discussion, because the realistic discussion is, hi, here's all this demand, you might be able to get $30 million a year for the next 10 years, how would you spend it? That's a real question. You might be able to muscle the state water contractors to do a whole lot more on islands that protect the water conveyance system, but they'd rather not pay it if they had the choice. Nobody wants to pay anything if they have the choice. The PPIC poll today found the same thing. Everybody wants the infrastructure protected, and they don't want gas taxes to go up. They don't want motor vehicle taxes to go up. They don't want anything to go up. And they all agree they pay too much money already. It's great. So I think rather, what I'd say is restructure number 2 into an agreement. Try to figure out how to avoid at least leaving the visual impression that we have ranked priorities within categories. That's the point the judge raised, I had raised with Dan yesterday, highways and railroads and rail corridors. I said, gee, is that a ranking system? And he assured me it's not a ranking system, but we ought to make that clear. And then we're going to wind up jumping, I think you're going to wind up jumping to things that are relevant. I think we're going to go back to protection of life and co-equal goals as a prime driver. That's my personal opinion, because it's the Delta Stewardship Council. But that then means the operational elements of water reliability, of ecosystem restoration start to play a role, favoring identifiable and provable multi-use projects ought to increase the likelihood of state participation, either in share of dollar amounts or likelihood of a grant. I'm not sure I'm making any sense that you are, but I should.
Dan, let me see if I can help. You have a pretty modest list of recommendations not to be further considered. Okay. The list of things to further consider are not an exhaustive list, but an attempt to identify general items. So can we, as a council, respond to the staff recommendation to adopt this list as such, that we have identified a modest number of items that at this point in time I don't feel rise to the level of a state interest, and that the A, B, C, and D represent general areas of interest, things such as hospitals, although they're not listed on here, would be a part of the people and properties section. Does that provide, if we took that approach, would that provide you the direction you need to set up the science panel that is scheduled for May?
That would be helpful.
Yes.
I mean, they're really asking, are we serious? Are we serious about saying no to anyone for anything? Isn't that what you're asking? Cindy?
I'm not asking anything.
Phil, I thought we had, in this discussion, bifurcated the list of priority items, or at least those we're going to call out as a group, from, in our staff memo on page 2, the 4 alternatives, which seem to me to be some restatements of kind of how we approach all these priorities. And we're not voting on that, right, Jessica?
No.
Okay. And so, I thought that needed some more work. I mean, I would re-identify them so that they don't have value judgments, so the first one would be retain essentially the current process. The second would be retain the current process with preferences. The third would be treat the delta as a single system. The fourth would be prioritize based on state values and goals. But that aside, maybe the preamble approach, which I found bracing like fresh air, be worth wrestling with, and maybe, you or others ought to assist staff, and we try and write some words and kick around how the preambles would look under one or more alternatives. For that matter, any interested party could suggest too. And so we might authorize the staff to go ahead to try and work up the tool, because it's relevant to our risk reduction strategy and tolerance and so forth. And then kind of buckle down for the next month to try and figure out what would be alternatives, such as these 4, more or less. But that they would take on kind of what Phil's suggesting, which is wrestling with, well, what exactly do we mean? And if we choose this, we're not choosing that. And somebody can propose, or we ought to put up a different proposal. We have a letter from Assemblymember Jim Fraser, for instance, who urges us to, I think, on brief reading, add some priorities and give a little more priority emphasis to those that are closer to his district. Who knows? But we can perhaps do that. So in other words, we could entertain a motion, perhaps pass it, go ahead with that tool, but recognize that it's going to have to fit in a different or larger structure, which the staff's already suggested with the 4 alternatives, but then we'll work more on those, and we'll invite public comment as they look at our work and perhaps suggest their own.
I second the motion.
Could you clarify the motion? We have a second, but...
No, I think the motion is just authorizing the staff report, and we take note, if we agree, that the work to do will be to consider the alternative priorities and approaches that will be stated in language that will be a preamble to any specification of delta interests to be protected.
So that's the motion,
I second it.
and Judge Damrell seconds. Any discussion on the motion?
My only request, Mr. Chair, is that maybe we have till May instead of April to bring this material back.
Is that acceptable with the maker of the motion? And second?
Just verbal status report in April.
Yeah, bring us a status report in April, and we'll expect a report in May. I think that's in keeping with the motion as it stands right now. Are we ready for the vote?
Yes.
Okay, let's begin.
Brown, yes.
Damrell, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Tatai and I.
Very good. Motion passes. Staff, thank you. We're not done yet. On to file item 11, Delta Levee Investment Strategy, the much-awaited risk analysis methodology and general updates.
Yeah, so thank you. Actually, I'm going to invite Larry Roth from Arcadis to come on up. He will be doing the presentation today. And in terms of general updates, I think I would just want to echo the announcements that our executive director made earlier about the 2 public meetings at the end of April. I just want to make sure that gets on folks' radar and in their schedules. And with that, I think...
Do we have dates for those?
We do. So on April 27th, we'll be meeting in Stockton, and the building's name escapes me, but we will get this information out on our webpage.
Okay.
And then on April 29th, we'll be meeting in Walnut Grove.
Very good.
And we're looking to, again, do evening-type meetings, so
Okay.
people can make it. But
Thank you. Larry?
Good afternoon, council members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Last month, you'll recall, I presented a discussion on tolerable risk, and I'd like to take the next steps today by describing how we might quantify risk and then use that quantification of risk, identify what is tolerable, and use that as a framework for how investments might be prioritized. I should emphasize from the outset that because we're operating with existing information for our study and analysis, some of which is dated and certainly could stand to be updated in the future. I think it's important to understand that these may not be characteristic of absolute risks as we develop them, but I think they're can be readily justified as recognition of relative risk within the delta. Does it need to be?
Change his name. Go by Dan Ray.
Okay. Thought it'd be helpful to begin by reviewing the methodology that we're using for the Delta Levee's investment strategy. And I'd like to point out right from the beginning that probably the most misused term in all of this discussion is the term risk. It is used in our everyday life to mean a variety of things, and you'll see later in my presentation that for the purposes of this discussion, risk has a very specific definition, and already in my first slide here I've used it incorrectly, so I apologize for that. But in the steps of the DLIS methodology, we want to first identify assets, and then that should really read hazards, not risk. We need to evaluate risks in this case without state investments. In other words, what are the baseline risks within the delta? That would enable us then to rank islands by risk, and you'll see a variety of categories of risk that we'll discuss today. And that's approximately where we are in the project at this point. Going forward, once proposed levee investments are identified, those investments can be ranked or prioritized, all for their ability to reduce risk to within limits that we might describe as tolerable. And then we can evaluate those investments with state participation and use that to develop a overall delta levee investment strategy. Next slide, please. So you've talked a considerable amount this afternoon about state interest, and they relate to the performance metrics that we're trying to develop. Obviously, major categories of life and property, ecosystem function, water supply reliability, all against the backdrop of the delta as a place. It's economic well-being, cultural, recreational, and agricultural, and natural resources. Next slide, please. For the purposes of quantifying risk, we've identified a number of metrics. Thank you. A number of metrics, and they fall into these broad categories. We have metrics regarding, and each of these I'll discuss in some detail. We have metrics for the expected annual damage from flooding, expected annual fatalities. We also have risks related to agriculture, expected annual agricultural land loss, risk related to changes in habitat from the environmental perspective, risk to water supply disruption, and then risks that might be associated with having to rehabilitate a failed flooded island.
Larry, one thing that occurred to me is to the extent that you and Cindy can use the same terms for your metrics that the staff is using on the memo and the larger policy declaration, it sure makes it a lot easier for me to understand it. You can get to each of those, and this may just be a proposed initial list or something like that, but it just seems to me we're talking about the same thing. We ought to come as close as we can to using similar language and metrics that fit with the evaluative process that Cindy's working on.
Yes, thank you. I mentioned earlier that I would give you a precise definition for risk, and that is shown at the lower part of this slide. Risk is classically the calculation of the probability of something happening times the consequences of that event. And in this case, we're looking specifically at the risk of flooding in the delta, and that's the product of a probability of a levee breach times the consequences should that breach occur. And I should say that because we'll be evaluating proposed projects, that there are direct effects. For example, if a proposed project is a setback levee, by construction of that project, we will be able to create perhaps waterside habitat at the expense of agricultural lands as that levee has moved inward. So that's a direct project effect. But many of the effects that we're going to be talking about are probabilistic. They're due to the potential for an eventual event that would cause a levee breach and flooding. Very quickly, we're looking at hazards, specifically according to riverine flooding, high water flooding, and to seismic events. Now, these are treated independently, and we're following prescribed methodologies to evaluate the probabilities, but those are the two major hazards that we're evaluating. And if we look at the risks of expected annual damages, these are damages to property, to assets, that's equal to the probability that that levee breach occurs times the asset value that's at risk or that's exposed, and then it's multiplied by a factor, just how much of that asset will be damaged by a flood. Certainly a flood that's 2 or 3 feet high on a structure is going to cause potentially much less damage than a flood that might be 12 feet deep. And that is taken into a consideration. And I point out at the bottom part of this slide, the expected annual damage calculation is the sum of that probabilistically could occur from a hydrologic or a flood event added to that could occur from a seismic event. We do a similar calculation for expected annual fatalities. It's the probability of a breach times the proportion of populations that's exposed times the proportion of those people that might actually die from drowning. And the proportion of population exposed is influenced, of course, by the warning time that may or may not exist, the willingness and ability to evacuate. So there are guidelines that are used to influence the proportion of population, and would add that as a specific example, typically with riverine flooding, there's lots of warning time, maybe several days of warning time, but in contrast, seismic event, there's no warning time, and so those are taken into account in these types of calculations. Agricultural land is particularly important in the Delta. We're looking at projected agricultural land that is a direct effect of potential projects. So we would look at land that's currently in agricultural use, and we perhaps could lose land because of the construction of new levees, and so that's a simple calculation. But there's also the probability, an expected annual agricultural land loss, which is the probability of a breach times that land lost in acres, with the assumption that that levee, that the island is not rehabilitated. So that would be land lost, and we've are able to quantify the risk for that. Similarly, in the environmental area, we have projected habitat that could either be gained or lost because of a particular levee project. Levee project may destroy habitat or may enhance habitat, but similarly, there's the potential, and on this slide, there's also the potential for change in channel margin habitat, and because one is in acres and one is in lineal feet, we're treating those as separate entities, but both are very important. We're using for our metrics here the Delta Plan existing habitat areas, so we are able to at least put some quality designation to either habitat lost or created. We're also looking at the expected annual change in habitat. Again, this would be due to a levee breach on an island that is not rehabilitated, and so we have an expected annual change in habitat that may occur if that levee is not rehabilitated. And for that, we're also relying on the Delta Plan, which shows the potential changes in habitat if a particular island is flooded. One of the metrics that we're having a good deal of discussion about now, we have to consider this a work in process, but we've characterized this as the expected annual water supply disruption risk. We're trying to identify the risk associated with a levee breach and what impact that might have on water supply disruption. We're looking at the islands that are in the proximity of the through conveyance corridor, as well as the western islands in particular. And our calculation there is, again, based on the probability of a levee breach, and a factor that we're describing as a conditional probability that that breach causes a disruption to water supply. Not all levee breaches in the Delta will have an impact on water supply, but many will. And those that do, we're characterizing them by the potential for flooded volume. In other words, the levee breaches and the island floods a particular volume of water. And then there are influence factors to that flooded volume that include the proximity of the island or the tract to the through conveyance corridor. It includes the modeling impact of salinity effects that could be associated with island flooding. And I should point out that in some cases, flooded islands have been shown to have a positive influence on salinity factors, and we're able to take that into account. And then we're also able to take into account islands that support particularly important in-delta or water supply infrastructure, and I would use the East Bay Mud aqueducts as a specific example there. So this is an all-inclusive water supply risk factor. And then finally, we're also looking at the expected annual rehabilitation costs that might be associated with a levee breach. If a levee does breach and the island is rehabilitated, there's a fixed cost associated with repairing the levee itself, and then a variable cost associated with pumping out the island to restore it. And so we'll have an expected annual rehabilitation cost. All of these will be presented, and this is a slide I showed at the last time, and this brings these all together where the expected annual fatalities can be shown as it varies throughout the Delta. Similarly, a risk map for expected annual damages can be shown, but we'll also be developing risk maps that clearly show water supply risk, risk to ecosystem functions, and risk to agriculture. And then the challenge, of course, is the upper layer, which is aggregate risk, and that is how all these risks may be combined at your discretion regarding how particular risk factors will be weighted. With that, I would be pleased to take any questions.
It's a great report, Larry. Questions, comments? Larry, the layered colors, I presume that in an analysis of all of these factors, there would be multiple colors that would arise on the map that represent the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of.
That's right. I think it's going to be a challenge to show an aggregate of all of them put together. But certainly we've got some prototype maps that show the expected annual damages, for example, and expected annual fatalities. And those are in various color-coded to particular levels of risk.
It would be helpful if you could provide us an example of what that looks like, even if it's from a different part of the country.
Actually, at last month's presentation, I showed you the Netherlands, the 2 maps from the Netherlands, expected annual damage, and
Okay.
and we'll be glad to show those, provide those to you.
How many layers of consideration were applied to that map?
Well, each of those are individual maps. So the ones that I showed you were just, one map was for expected annual damages, one map was for expected annual fatalities.
Okay, so that's what you anticipate coming out of our process is multiple maps?
Multiple maps, right.
As opposed to layers of colors that, okay. Okay,
Maybe way too,
yeah, well, that's what I was
too
wondering.
difficult to be able to see,
Okay,
yeah.
multiple maps, got it. Other comments or questions? Jess?
Just clarifying, I'm most familiar out of all of these with expected annual damage, but for the expected annual water supply disruption, it indicates that it's a score, and then expected annual rehabilitation costs imply numerical values. The others don't use those terms, but will be expressed also in numerical values.
They will, and that's one of our challenges, is we really do have apples and oranges. It would be, in an ideal world, if we could express everything in dollars or everything in acres, it would be much easier to deal with. But we will have some in dollars, some in acres, and some in other factors. And one of the things that the planning tool is able to do is enable us to be able to compare those so that we can put them all on a similar fashion or similar plane for making judgments, but we don't have to have them all in the same unit. So but that is a real challenge.
Okay, Susan?
In addition to the maps, will we be able to see the financial consequences of each scenario?
Well, yes. I mean, the expected annual damage map will be in dollars. Will be expressed in dollars. So that'll be the risk posed by levee breaches on an island by island basis, and that will be the total dollars of potential damage to all assets on that island, whether they be property, private property, businesses. It will include crop loss for agriculture, and it also includes costs associated with transportation, railroads, utilities, and so on. To the best that we can get asset information and the level of damage that flooding may occur, we'll be able to express that in dollars.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I have two requests for public comment. First is John Lopez.
Hi. The question I have is, well, actually, I have some comments and one or two questions. The first is this a, yeah, I'm sorry, is this a 10,000-foot view of the risks, or are you looking at the smaller components of the Delta system, or the individual islands of the system, and then looking at how they all contribute to a single event, or how are you going about deciding that risk?
I'm not sure I understand your...
Okay, what I'm basically saying is, let me put it in terms of an analogy. You rack the balls on the billiard table. You strike a rack set of balls one way, you're going to get some balls falling in a hole. If you hit it another way, you're not going to get them. So how are you approaching this, from the individual island point of view, or from this larger point of view, the system's point of view?
Well, we're characterizing the risks on an island-by-island basis in the Delta. We're still in process trying to determine the system's effect. We do know and we appreciate that there's the Delta is a system. The question is that we're facing, we're still trying to work through, is how can that be, how can that qualitative description of a system be put into quantitative factors that would enable us to put those into the risk equation.
So you're basically trying to decide just how the different components of the system are interacting in such a way to cause one to fail and another not to fail.
Well,
depending upon a...
Yeah, I think you have to appreciate that instantaneously, if we're predicting the failure of a particular island, at the moment of failure, nothing else has changed. But with the passage of time, if that island is not rehabilitated, it does have the potential of affecting its neighboring islands. It has the potential of affecting the hydrodynamic conditions in the delta and so on. So there are some potential long-term effects, but at the instance of failure, whether it's a system or not is not really important. It is very important to be able to consider it for long-term impacts.
And we're talking with some of the RDs and some of the folks that represent the RDs too. And we'll talk more with them, I think, about how, as Larry was saying, how do we categorize this system approach? Because as you can imagine, and from my understanding, from what I've been told, is effects between neighboring islands can take many different forms. And I think there's some expertise and local knowledge as to what's most likely to happen.
Right.
But we're still wrestling through how to categorize.
Okay, we've, like I said before, we've got about 1,000 line miles of data, and there are very distinct patterns as to where the levees are leaking, and that, we'd like to make available to you guys.
Wonderful.
But going a step further into this kind of a model, you have an island and you have a lot of small possible sources of damage. You get or risk. Risk of different scales in a particular island, and have you considered how they might accumulate to form enough of a risk for these catastrophic scenarios you're describing?
I'm going to punt that one to you, Larry.
The reason why I bring it up is
No,
because a lot of these islands have sloughs that have been filled in, or these islands have in fact been modified so that these sloughs no longer exist. And then you have features that were at the locations on the levees or on the natural levees that have been covered over and no longer visible. And I kind of wonder how you're able to assess that kind of risk when you have that many unknowns.
Yeah.
There certainly are, and what our basic analysis is highly dependent on what are called fragility curves for the levees on a particular island, and we're using existing information, most notably the DREAM study, but other more recent information for those fragility curves. The model that we're establishing will be able to be updated as those fragility curves are improved in the future, either because the levee is improved or perhaps degraded in the future because maintenance was not attended to, and in the future degraded fragility curves could be used. We're using, I think, defensively, we're assuming the weakest link philosophy, so that if a island has several fragility curves to choose from, we're using at this level of our analysis the weakest fragility curve, assuming that is then the weak point in the levee or in the island, and where the breach is most likely to occur, and gives us the highest probability of a failure then.
So you're defining the weakest in terms of the consequences and not necessarily the conditions?
No, we're defining the weakest in terms of the fragility, which is just the levee properties themselves, along with the potential for either the seismic excitation, the seismic event, or a flood event occurring, and what impact the water level or the seismic event has on the fragility curve, and therefore the levee stability.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and I was just going to say I want to make sure we follow up with you. And I think what would probably be helpful is to give you a little demonstration of the decision support tool we've been developing, just because we do have a whole suite of information for individual islands, and it would be great to run through that with you. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Terry Earlwine, State Water Contractors. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I haven't been here very much, and as it turns out, it looks like we've got a lot of people speaking on our behalf, so maybe I don't need to come back. But I just have to make sure the message is coordinated ahead of time, I guess. The main thing I wanted to do is just raise concern, or just express our interest in that annual water supply disruption risk score and just how it's being computed. And we recognize it's really early in the process, but we think that it would be good to have this. That the approach seems to be fairly simplistic, and there's a lot of other factors that may be considered in it. And one of the main factors is, instead of just looking at the levee condition themselves, to make sure that we factor in what the emergency response plan is. That could be a big part of what's needed to come up with the overall water supply disruption risk. It's a combination of how good are the levees to begin with versus what is your plan and how organized is that plan to respond to it. Then the other comment is that on the map that was shown of the water supply disruption risk, the area shown for through conveyance is much larger than what we're considering. We're focused on the area south of the San Joaquin River, on the old and middle rivers, the emergency pathway corridor. So that's, I don't know how far along that is, but that's where we're focused on as being the critical need. And also wanted to thank or recognize what Mr. Roth said about how flooded islands don't necessarily always cause adverse salinity impacts. It depends on the location of the island and where are they at, and how does that affect the tidal prism, and how does that affect tidal trapping. So there's a lot of other processes involved, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. So thank you. Appreciate the chance.
Terry,
to comment.
Patrick has a question for you.
How much do the contractors pay to fortify the levees along the waterways that you need to get to the pumps?
We have paid some for maintenance on Sherman and Twitchell Islands. I don't have the numbers on it, but it's not that much. Yeah, and what we want to make sure of is that as we go forward, that the things that we see as benefiting us, that are things that really truly benefit us, that we don't have this wide net cast that says basically every levee everywhere that touches a channel is a water supply responsibility.
Do you think that those levees that are essential to the any through delta transfer of water, which occurs now and will occur in the future too, would be the financial obligation of the contractors?
I think we're recognizing that there's a discussion to be had on that. We don't have any position on that per se.
Okay, thanks. Phil?
Do you contemplate in your plan any consequences from the operation of the underground tunnels as proposed in BDCP that might aggravate the situation, requiring the need of some kind of contingency fund to prevent it? I mean, for example, during periods of high pumping, which we visualize, everybody visualizes would be certainly in wet years, maybe it's not a problem, but what's the interplay that you're planning on, if any, for that?
I think we don't have any plan in place for that. I'd be interested in kind of exactly what kind of impacts you're thinking about, and we could talk about that. And I think in general, it's kind of the same plan either way. There's, even with, if you had Bay Delta Conservation Plan in place, you still have a substantial dependence on conveyance through the Delta, so that's a constant in what goes forward.
Okay. Larry?
I'd like to thank Mr. Earlwine for his comments. Appreciate it. The risk score is something that we're still, it's a work in process. And we appreciate all the help and advice we've gotten from a lot of the stakeholders in helping us refine it. We'll look for more. I might point out that the map, one of the factors of the map, though, is a proximity factor. So it does include the islands immediately adjacent having the largest impact, but as you move away from the corridor, it is a much lesser impact. So we've tried to reflect that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Last blue slip, Melinda Terry.
Thank you. Melinda Terry, Central Valley Flood Control Association. And yes, as I was mentioning yesterday, we had a big meeting on this whole issue of operation, maintenance, repair, replacement, and rehabilitation. And in reality, when you think about reducing risk and this tolerance for risk, once you kind of, and we do think they're on the right track, as Mr. Zuckerman was saying earlier, of you need to figure out what the tolerance is and then what kind of level of things you need to do. You need to know what the baseline is so you know where you're starting from, sort of deal. But really, maintenance, your annual maintenance is your most cost-effective way to be keeping up with that reduced risk, if you will. And as Dan said it really well, earlier, the demands, and I would add requirements, have been growing in recent years. And while our expenses have been reduced, and a lot of the conversation yesterday was about this growing requirements and demands that they were kind of calling transactional cost that you may not think about, but is really important because to get that risk down, these are the most cost-effective ways is doing your maintenance. But the permitting itself, one of the upper San Joaquin had given the example, they've had to abandon flood protection projects because the permitting process became so expensive and their limited budget, they just had to abandon the project in and of itself. They gave another example where their district has 2 trucks that do maintenance, and but the air board passed new air quality rules. And so their choice was to either fix those trucks or buy new ones. And frankly, it's so expensive to even fix them. They had to buy new ones at a cost of $500,000. Their total annual budget is $1 million. So that means they really had to dig into what's their emergency money that comes around. And the other thing that really got brought up was by them, and granted it's not directly in the Delta, but I think it's one of the things that relates to the earlier document that you approved, the C portion of those habitat projects, which is the Upper San Joaquin has had significant maintenance funding issues because they've had a large conversion of their agricultural land to habitat. And they don't pay assessments. You may think the state government, even when they have those lands, they don't. We have to sue them. Caltrans doesn't even pay. But when they convert to habitat, so when I look at that previous list that you approved, and you're talking about prioritizing funding with levee money, habitat projects for water supply, and then as those acres get converted, they aren't going to pay assessments to actually do the maintenance for the flood protection. It's going to start skewing how much the state may have to start picking up if you think about it that way. But in addition, those types of projects are actually creating additional maintenance costs. So on your list, for instance, you had the YOLO bypass, which is not really clear, but I assume is the inundation portion for the meeting the biological opinions to inundate the YOLO bypass more frequently. As I said, we already have a sediment and vegetation management issue for that bypass and the one just north of it, Sutter Bypass. The Department of Water Resources does not really get to do annual maintenance. They don't even annually inspect them. And but if you inundate that more frequently, and if the farming is not occurring, that's part of the maintenance that occurs. But as you start creating some of the cash slough habitat in other areas and expanding that and converting it, and they're not paying assessments, those are additional costs of our annual maintenance that now go up at a time that we really are seeing a decline in funding. So really give some thought. Again, I know you passed it, but think about what really is a flood project and levee improvements that need to do versus habitat projects, which may actually increase some of the risk and the costs for long-term maintenance. Thanks.
Thank you, Melinda. Anything else on file item 11? Thank you very much. File item 12, public comment. Hearing none. That leads us to the final item, meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming.